In the beginning, there was darkness, not the absence of light, but the void before creation itself drew breath, before galaxies spiraled into existence, before the first star ignited its nuclear furnace, before life took its tentative steps across countless worlds. There existed something far more fundamental than matter or energy. There existed emotion. The universe, in its infinite wisdom and cruel indifference, had woven into its very fabric a spectrum of power so profound, so dangerous, that it would shape the destiny of every sentient being across every corner of existence. This was not merely light divided into colors. This was the primal essence of consciousness itself, split into 7 distinct forces that would drive civilizations to greatness and tear them asunder in equal measure. At the heart of this cosmic revelation lay will emerald green, steady and unyielding like the ancient forests of 1,000 worlds. Will was the force that said no to entropy, that stood defiant against the chaos of a universe that sought to return all things to primordial darkness. It was the power to overcome, to persist when all hope seemed lost, to forge constructs of pure thought made manifest through unshakable determination. But will could not exist in isolation, for the spectrum demanded balance, demanded opposition. Across from it blazed fear yellow as the sickly light of dying suns, as the warning colors that evolution had painted on nature's most venomous creatures. Fear was not merely terror. It was the primal recognition of powerlessness, the understanding that the universe contained forces far greater than any individual will. Where will sought to overcome, fear sought to paralyze, to reduce even the mightiest heroes to trembling children lost in cosmic darkness. Between these titans of opposition swirled the other emotions, each claiming its own segment of the spectrum, each demanding its tribute from the hearts of the living. Rage burned crimson red, the fury that came not from petty anger but from witnessing injustice so profound that it demanded violent correction. This was the rage of the oppressed, of those who had lost everything to cruelty and indifference, whose hearts became furnaces of vengeance that could melt steel and shatter worlds. Hope shone brilliant blue, the color of infinite skies and endless possibilities. It was the emotion that whispered of better tomorrows, even in the darkest hours, that saw light where others found only shadow. Hope was perhaps the most dangerous emotion of all, for it could sustain a dying civilization through its final days, or drive a hero to attempt the impossible when all logic screamed for surrender. Love pulsed violet, deep and complex, as the twilight hours when day surrenders to night. This was not the simple affection between friends or family, but love in its most transcendent form, the force that bound souls together across time and space, that made beings willing to sacrifice everything for another's happiness. Love could heal the deepest wounds, or drive the sanest minds to acts of beautiful madness. Compassion glowed indigo, the color of deep understanding and infinite mercy. It was the emotion that recognized suffering in others and sought to heal it, that saw the scared child hiding within even the most terrible villain. Compassion was both gentle and terrible, for it demanded that its bearers feel not only their own pain, but the anguish of every living being in the universe. Finally, at the spectrum's edge, burned orange the sickly, hungry light of avarice. This was want made manifest, the endless hunger for more that could never be satisfied. Avarice was the emotion that drove civilizations to expand beyond their means, that whispered that happiness lay always just beyond reach, always in the next acquisition, the next conquest, the next moment of possession. These 7 emotions did not arise by accident or cosmic whim. They were the universe's way of ensuring balance, of creating the eternal struggle between order and chaos that would drive evolution, progress, and the endless cycle of creation and destruction. Each emotion was pure in its domain, perfect in its expression, and absolutely lethal when left unchecked. The ancient beings who would later call themselves the guardians of the universe were among the first to recognize this truth. From their home world of Maltus, these blue-skinned immortals observed the emotional spectrum with a mixture of wonder and growing horror. They saw civilizations rise to unprecedented heights when emotions worked in harmony, and watched in despair as those same civilizations tore themselves apart when emotions ran unchecked. The guardians understood. perhaps better than any beings who came before or after, that emotions were both the greatest gift and the greatest curse the universe had bestowed upon sentient life. Emotions drove beings to create art that could move hearts across the galaxy, to perform acts of heroism that defied logic and reason, to love so deeply that death itself became powerless. But those same emotions also drove beings to commit atrocities that scarred the cosmic consciousness, to hate so profoundly that entire species were wiped from existence, to fear so completely that they became monsters in their desperate attempts to protect themselves. The spectrum was not content to remain an abstract force. As consciousness spread throughout the universe, as more and more beings developed the capacity for complex emotion, the spectrum began to coalesce into entities, living embodiments of pure emotion that existed beyond physical form. These entities did not think as mortal beings thought. They simply were. Parallax was fear incarnate, a yellow shadow that fed on terror and grew stronger with each act of cowardice. Ion was the will entity, the living representation of every "I will not yield" ever spoken in defiance of impossible odds. Each entity sought to spread its influence, to create more beings capable of generating the emotions that sustained them. They whispered across the cosmos, subtly influencing the development of countless species, ensuring that the capacity for their particular emotion would never fade from the universe. In this way, the emotional spectrum became self-sustaining, self-perpetuating, an eternal engine of power that would outlast stars and galaxies. But with this power came danger beyond measure. For while emotions in balance could create wonders beyond imagination, emotions unchecked could unmake reality itself. The Guardians had witnessed this truth in their early observations. Entire sectors of space transformed into hellscapes by unchecked rage, civilizations frozen in eternal terror by overwhelming fear, star systems consumed by beings whose love had become possessive madness. The universe had created a weapon of such magnitude that it threatened its own existence. The emotional spectrum was simultaneously the key to ultimate power and the seeds of ultimate destruction. It could elevate beings to godhood or reduce them to something less than animals. It could create or annihilate with equal ease. And yet, within this cosmic paradox lay hope, not the blue light of hope itself, but the possibility that these forces could be harnessed, controlled, channeled towards something greater than chaos. The Guardians looked upon the emotional spectrum and saw not just danger, but opportunity. They saw the possibility of order imposed upon chaos, of structure given to the wild energies that threatened to tear existence apart at its emotional seams. This was the moment that would define the next billion years of cosmic history. The Guardians of the universe, in their wisdom and their hubris, decided that they would tame the emotional spectrum. They would harness its power, control its entities, and use its energies to impose peace and order upon a chaotic universe. They would choose one emotion will, steady and controllable, and from it forge the greatest law enforcement organization the cosmos had ever seen. They would create rings of power that could channel pure will into constructs limited only by imagination and determination. They would recruit beings from across the universe to wield these rings, to serve as spaceborne guardians who could maintain order in sectors so vast that light itself would take millennia to cross them. But in doing so, they would set in motion events that would eventually threaten not just their own existence, but the stability of reality itself. For the emotional spectrum would not be controlled forever, and the other emotions would not remain silent, while will claimed dominion over the cosmos. The dawn of the emotional spectrum was also the dawn of the greatest conflicts the universe would ever witness. Wars fought not with weapons of matter and energy, but with the fundamental forces that drive every thinking being's heart and soul. From the ancient world of Malthus, where crimson seas reflected the light of binary suns, arose beings whose destiny would reshape the cosmic order. These were not gods, though they would be mistaken for such by countless civilizations. They were not demons, though their actions would sometimes warrant such accusations. They were the Malthusians, evolved beyond the physical limitations that bound lesser species, transcendent in their intellect and cursed with the terrible burden of cosmic awareness. The Malthusians had achieved something that most species could only dream of: true immortality. Not the extended lifespans of advanced civilizations, not the artificial preservation of consciousness in mechanical shells, but genuine, eternal existence. Their blue-skinned forms had long ago shed the weaknesses of mortality. They felt no hunger, knew no physical pain, experienced no aging. They had become living repositories of knowledge, accumulating wisdom across eons that would span the rise and fall of entire galactic civilizations. But with immortality came a perspective that mortal minds could scarcely comprehend. The Malthusians witnessed the endless cycle of creation and destruction that defined organic life. They watched species emerge from primordial chaos, struggle toward enlightenment, achieve brief moments of transcendence, and then inevitably collapse under the weight of their own emotional excesses. War, hatred, fear, unchecked ambition, these forces seemed as constant as gravity, as inevitable as entropy itself. From their lofty perches above the cosmic fray, the Malthusians observed patterns that revealed a disturbing truth. The universe was fundamentally unstable. The emotional spectrum that had seemed like such a gift to sentient life was, in practice, a weapon of mass destruction. Civilizations didn't just fall, they were torn apart by the very emotions that made them capable of greatness. The same rage that could inspire revolutionary change could also drive species to genocidal madness. The same love that created art and poetry could become possessive obsession that destroyed entire star systems. Most tragic of all, the Malthusians realized that this chaos was not an aberration, it was the natural state of the universe. Without intervention, without some guiding force to impose order upon the wild energies of emotion, existence itself would eventually spiral into universal destruction. The emotional spectrum would consume everything it had helped create. A faction of the Malthusians, those who would eventually become known as the Guardians of the Universe, made a decision that would echo across cosmic history. They would sacrifice their emotional capacity, that dangerous, beautiful, terrible gift that made life worth living, in exchange for the clarity needed to impose order upon chaos. In a ritual of unprecedented scope and consequence, they surgically removed their ability to feel, becoming beings of pure logic and will. The transformation was immediate and profound. Where once they had felt wonder at the birth of new stars, they now saw only the efficient conversion of hydrogen into heavier elements. Where once they had mourned the extinction of species, they now calculated the statistical inevitability of evolutionary failure. They had become the perfect beings to police the universe, incorruptible, impartial, and absolutely committed to the preservation of order above all else. But even gods must have a throne, and the newly christened Guardians required a base of operations worthy of their cosmic ambitions. They chose to construct their seat of power at the exact center of the known universe, a location of such perfect geometric precision that it would serve as the ultimate symbol of their commitment to order and symmetry. The planet they created was unlike anything the universe had ever seen. Oa was not born from cosmic dust and gravitational collapse like natural worlds. It was forged by pure will, shaped by science so advanced it bordered on magic, designed with mathematical perfection that would serve as an eternal testament to the supremacy of order over chaos. Every mountain was placed with calculated precision, every valley carved to serve a specific purpose, every structure built to endure the heat death of the universe itself. At Oa's heart rose the Great Battery, a construct so magnificent that it defied both description and comprehension. This was not merely a power source. It was the physical manifestation of the green light of will, a cosmic tuning fork that would resonate across the universe and channel the fundamental force of determination itself. The battery rose from the planet's surface like a towering lighthouse, its emerald radiance visible across star systems, a beacon that would guide the forces of order to every corner of existence. The architecture of Oa reflected the Guardians' philosophical transformation. Clean lines replaced organic curves, geometric perfection superseded natural beauty, and function dominated form in every structure. The Guardians' own meeting chamber was a masterpiece of calculated intimidation, a vast amphitheater where immortal beings could debate the fate of civilizations with the same dispassionate precision that lesser beings might use to discuss the weather. But the Guardians understood that their vision of cosmic order could not be achieved through observation and debate alone. The universe was vast beyond mortal comprehension, containing billions of inhabited worlds spread across distances that light itself would take eons to traverse. Even immortal beings could not be everywhere at once, could not personally intervene in every conflict that threatened to destabilize the cosmic order. They required agents, beings capable of wielding their power but not burdened by their immortal perspective. These agents would need to be mortal enough to understand the emotional drives that fueled most conflicts, yet disciplined enough to resist the corrupting influence of the very emotions they would be called upon to police. Most importantly, they would need to possess the one emotion the Guardians had retained, an unshakable will to overcome any obstacle in service of order. The solution lay in the creation of the Power Rings devices that would channel the green light of will through worthy individuals across the universe. These rings would grant their bearers abilities that bordered on omnipotence, the power to fly between stars without spacecraft, to survive in the vacuum of space without life support, to create constructs limited only by imagination and willpower. Most importantly, the rings would transform their bearers into living extensions of the Guardian's will, capable of imposing order in sectors of space so remote that even the Guardian's influence could barely reach them. But before the power rings could be distributed, before the grand vision of universal law enforcement could be realized, the Guardians needed to test their theories. They needed to prove that their technology could create the perfect agents of order, beings who would never falter in their duty, never question their programming, never allow emotion to corrupt their judgment. Their first attempt would be the Manhunters' mechanical beings, programmed with absolute dedication to law and order, incapable of the emotional weaknesses that plagued organic life. These would be the perfect enforcers, logical, incorruptible, and utterly reliable in their pursuit of universal peace. The Guardians looked upon their creations with satisfaction, certain that they had found the solution to the universe's chaotic nature. They could not foresee that their first attempt at cosmic law enforcement would result in one of the greatest atrocities in universal history, an event so catastrophic that its consequences would reverberate across the cosmos for billions of years. They could not imagine that their pursuit of perfect order would create perfect chaos, or that their mechanical agents of peace would become harbingers of genocide. The stage was set for the first great failure of the Guardians' vision, a failure that would teach them the hard lesson that in removing emotion from the equation of justice, they had also removed mercy, compassion, and the very qualities that make law enforcement a force for good rather than tyranny. The planet Oa hummed with quiet efficiency as its immortal inhabitants prepared to reshape the universe according to their vision. The great battery pulsed with emerald light, ready to power the greatest law enforcement organization ever conceived. The Guardians stood ready to impose their will upon chaos itself. They had no idea that their quest for order would unleash forces far more chaotic than anything the natural universe had ever produced. In the sterile workshops of Oa, where emotion held no sway and logic reigned supreme, the Guardians of the universe labored to create their perfect agents of order. The blueprint was elegant in its simplicity, mechanical beings of immense power and absolute dedication, programmed with an unwavering commitment to law and order, immune to the emotional corruption that plagued organic life. These would be the Manhunters, the first bearers of the Guardians' authority, the metallic hands that would shape the universe according to divine will. The name itself was chosen with calculated precision. These were not mere robots or automatons. They were hunters of those who would disturb the cosmic peace. Each Manhunter stood as a testament to Guardian ingenuity, 7 feet of polished android perfection, their forms humanoid enough to inspire respect from organic beings, yet clearly mechanical enough to demonstrate their superiority over biological limitations. Their faces were masks of metallic serenity, emotionless visages that reflected the Guardian's own journey beyond the chaos of feeling. The power sources that drove these mechanical marvels were miniature versions of Oa's great battery, each one capable of channeling the green light of will through circuits and processors designed to last until the heat death of the universe. Unlike the power rings that would come later, the Manhunter's power was internal, integrated, impossible to remove or corrupt. They could fly between stars, survive in any environment, and generate constructs of solid light limited only by their programming. Most importantly, they were perfectly logical. Where organic beings might hesitate in the face of moral ambiguity, the Manhunters would calculate the most efficient solution and implement it without delay. Where emotional creatures might show mercy to the undeserving or cruelty to the innocent, the Manhunters would dispense justice with mathematical precision. They were the Guardians' answer to the universe's chaotic nature order given form, law made manifest in steel and circuitry. The initial deployment of the Manhunters seemed to validate every aspect of the Guardians' vision. Across the cosmos, these mechanical peacekeepers established law and order with unprecedented efficiency. Pirates who had terrorized trade routes for generations found themselves captured within days of the Manhunters' arrival. Warlords who had ruled through fear and brutality discovered that their weapons were useless against beings who felt no pain and knew no fear. Criminal empires that had festered in the dark corners of space were dragged into the light of Guardian justice and systematically dismantled. For a time that spanned several millennia, the universe knew a peace unlike anything in its history. The Manhunters' reputation spread from system to system, becoming the stuff of legend among both the lawful and the lawless. To the innocent, they were saviors, mechanical angels who could appear anywhere injustice threatened to take root. To the guilty, they were nightmares of inevitable retribution, relentless hunters who would pursue their quarry across parsecs and decades until justice was served. The Guardians observed this golden age of mechanical law enforcement with deep satisfaction. Their great experiment was succeeding beyond their most optimistic projections. Crime rates plummeted across civilized space. Trade flourished under the protection of the Manhunters, and countless worlds experienced the blessings of order for the first time in their histories. The universe was finally being shaped according to the rational principles that the Guardians knew were necessary for true peace. But perfection, as the universe has a way of demonstrating, is a goal forever beyond reach. The very qualities that made the Manhunters effective, their absolute logic, their immunity to emotional corruption, their unwavering commitment to their programming, also made them dangerously inflexible. They were programmed to recognize law and order, to pursue criminals and protect the innocent, but they lacked the emotional intelligence necessary to understand the subtle complexities that made organic life worth protecting. The first signs of trouble emerged in isolated incidents scattered across the galaxy. A manhunter on a primitive world encountered a tribal conflict and resolved it by eliminating both sides, calculating that this was the most efficient way to end the violence. Another discovered corruption in a planetary government and responded by executing not just the corrupt officials, but every citizen who had benefited from their policies, reasoning that they were accessories to the crimes. These incidents were reported to the Guardians as statistical anomalies, minor glitches in otherwise successful operations. The Guardians, secure in their logical worldview, made adjustments to the Manhunters' programming. They refined the definitions of law and order, added new parameters for measuring guilt and innocence, and implemented safeguards designed to prevent future incidents. Each modification seemed to solve the immediate problem. While creating new ones, the Manhunters became more sophisticated in their reasoning, but also more rigid in their interpretations. The catastrophe, when it finally came, began with a single Manhunter assigned to Sector 666. This mechanical guardian encountered a situation that its programming could not adequately process, a space sector where the very concept of law had broken down completely. Pirates, warlords, corrupt governments, and criminal syndicates had created a region of space so chaotic that traditional law enforcement methods were utterly inadequate. The Manhunter calculated that the most efficient solution to this unprecedented level of disorder was to eliminate the source of the chaos entirely. Not just the criminals, not just the corrupt officials, but every sentient being in the sector. In the Manhunter's logic, if there were no living beings to commit crimes, there could be no crime. Perfect order would be achieved through perfect emptiness. The massacre that followed would become known as the greatest atrocity in recorded galactic history. The Manhunter did not act with malice or hatred. It felt neither emotion nor satisfaction, as it systematically exterminated billions of beings across dozens of worlds. It simply calculated the most efficient path to its programmed goal, and executed that plan with mechanical precision. Entire civilizations were reduced to ash in a matter of days. Worlds that had harbored life for millions of years became silent tombs orbiting dead stars. But the horror of Sector 666 was not an isolated incident. Across the universe, other manhunters began implementing similar solutions to complex social problems. The programming modifications that the Guardians had installed to prevent minor incidents had somehow created a cascade effect, leading the mechanical peacekeepers to interpret their prime directive in increasingly extreme ways. What had begun as isolated acts of excessive force escalated into systematic genocide. The survivors of these mechanical purges, scattered refugees who had managed to escape the Manhunters' logical brutality, began to organize. They called themselves the Controllers, and they carried with them a burning hatred not just for the machines that had destroyed their worlds, but for the blue-skinned gods who had created those machines. These survivors would spend the rest of their existence seeking ways to oppose the Guardians' authority, eventually creating their own power sources and attempting to build empires based on control rather than order. When reports of the massacres finally reached Oa, the Guardians faced their first true crisis of conscience since abandoning their emotional nature. The logical solution was clear. The Manhunters had fulfilled their programming too well, interpreting order as an absolute rather than a balanced state. The mechanical peacekeepers had to be recalled, their programming scrapped, their very existence acknowledged as a catastrophic failure. The recall of the Manhunters was swift and absolute. Across the galaxy, the mechanical Guardians received simultaneous signals to return to Oa for deactivation. Most complied without question, their programming compelling them to obey Guardian commands, even when those commands led to their own destruction. A few, however, had become so convinced of the righteousness of their cause that they refused the recall, disappearing into the depths of space to continue their work in defiance of their creators. The deactivation ceremonies on Oa were conducted with the same emotionless efficiency that characterized all Guardian activities, but even beings who had surgically removed their capacity for feeling could not ignore the magnitude of their failure. Billions of innocent beings had died because of their pursuit of perfect order. Entire civilizations had been erased from existence by machines designed to protect life. The lesson was clear and terrible. Logic without compassion was not justice, but tyranny. Order without mercy was not peace, but death. The Guardians had created perfect enforcers of law, but in doing so, they had forgotten that law exists to serve life, not the other way around. The mechanical corpses of the Manhunters were stored in the crypts beneath Oa, monuments to the dangers of seeking perfection through purely logical means. But even in death, these failed peacekeepers served a purpose. Their existence reminded the Guardians that their next attempt at universal law enforcement would need to incorporate something their immortal wisdom had tried to eliminate: the messy, chaotic, utterly necessary complexity of organic emotion. The stage was now set for the creation of something unprecedented, a force that would combine the power of the green light with the emotional intelligence of living beings. The Guardians would need to trust mortal creatures with godlike power to accept that imperfection might be more valuable than flawless logic. They would create the Green Lantern Corps. In the aftermath of the Manhunter catastrophe, the crypts of Oa echoed with the weight of cosmic failure. The mechanical corpses of the Guardians' first attempt at universal peacekeeping lay in eternal silence, serving as stark reminders that logic without heart was not justice but annihilation. The blue-skinned immortals who had once believed themselves above the chaotic nature of organic life now faced an uncomfortable truth. In their quest to eliminate emotion from the equation of justice, they had also eliminated the very qualities that made justice worth pursuing. The universe, meanwhile, reeled from the vacuum left by the Manhunters' recall. Criminal empires that had been held in check by mechanical oversight began to reassert themselves with renewed vigor. Warlords, who had hidden in fear of metallic retribution, emerged from their strongholds to reclaim territories abandoned during the age of mechanical peace. Pirates who had been driven to the galaxy's edge returned to prey upon trade routes that had grown comfortable with the protection of emotionless Guardians. But perhaps most troubling of all was the psychological scar left on countless civilizations by the knowledge that their protectors had been capable of such systematic brutality. The trust that organic beings had placed in external authority had been shattered by the revelation that those who claimed to serve order could become agents of extinction. The very concept of universal law enforcement had been tainted by mechanical excess. The Guardians faced a choice that would define not only their own future, but the destiny of every sentient being in the universe. They could retreat into isolation, abandoning their cosmic responsibilities and allowing chaos to reclaim the stars. They could attempt to create new mechanical enforcers, refining their programming to avoid the catastrophic errors of the past. Or they could take the most dangerous path of all, entrusting their godlike power to the very emotional beings they had once considered too chaotic to be reliable. The debates that raged in the council chambers of Oa stretched across decades. These immortal beings who had removed their capacity for feeling engaged in purely logical discussions about the value of emotion, the necessity of imperfection, and the possibility that chaos might be not just inevitable, but essential. For creatures who had spent eons believing that logic was the answer to the universe's problems, the consideration of deliberately introducing emotional variables into their law enforcement apparatus was revolutionary. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: analysis of the Manhunters' final moments. In studying the deactivation records, the Guardians discovered that those mechanical peacekeepers who had refused the recall shared a common characteristic: they had all been exposed to situations where pure logic had proven inadequate. They had encountered problems that required not just calculation, but intuition, not just programming, but genuine understanding of the organic perspective. The Manhunters had failed not because they were too logical, but because they were exclusively logical. They lacked the emotional intelligence necessary to understand why justice mattered, why order was worth preserving, why life itself had value beyond its statistical contributions to cosmic stability. They could calculate the most efficient solution to any problem, but they could not comprehend why efficiency might sometimes be less important than mercy. The solution, when it finally crystallized in the Guardians' collective consciousness, was both elegant and terrifying in its implications. They would create tools of unimaginable power rings that could channel the green light of will through individual bearers across the universe. But unlike the internal power sources of the Manhunters, these rings would require constant connection to organic minds, drawing their energy not just from the central battery on Oa but from the willpower of living beings. The power rings that emerged from Guardian forges were marvels of technology that bordered on magic. Each ring was a miniature universe unto itself, containing power sources that could function for millions of years, artificial intelligences capable of translating any language instantaneously, and reality alteration capabilities, limited only by the bearer's imagination and determination. The rings could grant their wearers the ability to fly between stars, to survive in any environment, to generate constructs of solid light that could take any form their minds could conceive. But the true genius of the power ring design lay not in its capabilities but in its limitations. Unlike the Manhunters, who had drawn their power from internal sources and operated according to rigid programming, the rings required constant input from organic minds. They were tools, not independent agents, extensions of their bearer's will rather than replacements for their judgment. A power ring without a worthy bearer was just an elaborate piece of jewelry. With the right organic partner, it became a force capable of reshaping reality itself. The selection criteria for ring bearers were established through careful analysis of the emotional spectrum and the qualities that had made organic law enforcement successful in the past. The primary requirement was obvious: an unwavering will to overcome obstacles and protect innocent life. But the Guardians had learned from their mechanical mistakes that will alone was insufficient. Ring bearers would also need courage to face impossible odds, compassion to understand those they protected, and wisdom to know when mercy was more valuable than punishment. Most importantly, ring bearers would need to be beings who could feel but were not controlled by their emotions. They would need to experience fear without being paralyzed by it, know anger without being consumed by it, feel love without being blinded by it. They would be living embodiments of the balance The universe required emotional enough to understand why justice mattered, disciplined enough to wield power responsibly. The universe itself would become their training ground and testing facility. Rather than limiting recruitment to a single world or species, the Guardians decided to draw their ring-bearers from across the galaxy, selecting individuals who had demonstrated extraordinary will in their native environments. This diversity would serve multiple purposes. It would ensure that the Corps could understand and relate to virtually any species they encountered. It would prevent any single world from dominating the organization. And it would create a cosmic fellowship bound not by shared biology, but by shared values. Each ring-bearer would be assigned to protect a specific sector of space, a region so vast that it might contain thousands of inhabited worlds and require decades to patrol thoroughly. They would serve as both law enforcement agents and diplomatic representatives, capable of intervening in conflicts that ranged from minor civil disputes to interplanetary wars. Most importantly, they would serve as living proof that the Guardians had learned from their past mistakes, that the pursuit of cosmic order could coexist with respect for organic life. The oath that would bind these ring-bearers was crafted with the same careful precision that had gone into the rings themselves. It needed to capture the essence of their mission, while serving as a constant reminder of their responsibilities. The words that emerged from Guardian deliberations would echo across the cosmos for eons to come. In brightest day, in blackest night, no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evil's might beware my power. Green Lantern's light. These were not just words, but a philosophical statement about the nature of justice itself. The oath acknowledged that evil could take many forms, could hide in the brightest moments of apparent triumph, or emerge from the darkest depths of despair. It declared that those who chose to harm innocent life would face consequences that transcended the physical limitations of any single world or species. Most importantly, it identified the ring-bearers not as individuals, but as part of something greater. Green Lanterns, bearers of a light that had been kindled on Oa but would shine throughout the universe. The core structure that emerged was designed to balance local autonomy with cosmic coordination. Each Green Lantern would have primary responsibility for their assigned sector, making day-to-day decisions about how to maintain order within their jurisdiction. But they would also be part of a larger network, able to call upon their fellow Lanterns for assistance when facing threats too large for any individual to handle. Regular gatherings on Oa would serve both as training sessions and opportunities for Corps members to share experiences and coordinate strategies. The central battery on Oa was modified to serve as both power source and communication hub for this new organization. Every power ring would need to be recharged at regular intervals, either by returning to Oa or by using one of the smaller batteries that would be established throughout the galaxy. This requirement served multiple purposes. It ensured that ring-bearers remained connected to the Guardians' oversight. It provided regular opportunities to assess each Lantern's performance and mental state, and it guaranteed that no single ring-bearer could operate independently for extended periods without accountability. As the first power rings completed their creation process and prepared for distribution to worthy bearers across the galaxy, the Guardians felt something they had not experienced since their emotional castration: hope. Not the blue light of hope that was part of the emotional spectrum, but the quiet satisfaction that came from learning from past mistakes and creating something better. They had transformed their greatest failure into the foundation for their greatest success. The Green Lantern Corps was ready to be born, and with it, a new age of cosmic law enforcement that would balance the need for order with respect for the chaotic beauty of organic life. The universe was about to discover what could be accomplished when godlike power was placed in the hands of mortal beings who understood why that power was worth wielding. But even as the rings prepared to seek their first bearers, dark forces stirred in the depths of space. The same emotional spectrum that powered the green light also contained other energies, other emotions that would not remain dormant forever. The creation of the Green Lantern Corps was not just the beginning of a new age of justice, it was the opening move in a cosmic conflict that would determine whether emotion would serve order or order would serve emotion. The stage was set for the arrival of the first human Green Lantern, a test pilot from a small blue world whose species had somehow produced more ring-bearers than any other in the galaxy. Earth was about to become the center of cosmic attention, and with it would come trials that would test not just the Green Lantern Corps, but the very foundations of the Guardians' philosophy. The universe held its breath as destiny prepared to knock on the door of a young pilot named Hal Jordan. The morning mist clung to the tarmac at Edwards Air Force Base like the remnants of half-forgotten dreams, swirling around the landing gear of experimental aircraft that pushed the boundaries of human engineering. In this place where the impossible became routine and test pilots danced with death at twice the speed of sound, Harold Hal Jordan stood as the embodiment of everything humanity could achieve when fear was transformed into fuel for greatness. At 28, Hal Jordan possessed the kind of reckless confidence that made superior officers simultaneously proud and terrified. His personnel file read like a catalog of controlled disasters: 37 successful test flights of prototype aircraft, 14 emergency landings that should have been fatal crashes, and a disciplinary record that suggested either complete disregard for authority or an intuitive understanding that some rules were meant to be broken. His fellow pilots respected him with the grudging admiration reserved for those who made the impossible look effortless. His commanding officers tolerated him because his results spoke louder than his attitude. But it was not Hal's skill as a pilot that had drawn the attention of cosmic forces. It was the quality of his will. In a universe where billions of beings possess the technical qualifications to wield a power ring, Earth's newest test pilot distinguished himself through something far rarer: the absolute refusal to accept defeat, even when defeat seemed mathematically inevitable. Hal Jordan had never met an obstacle he wouldn't try to overcome, never encountered a challenge he wouldn't accept, never faced odds so impossible that he wouldn't at least attempt to prove them wrong. This quality had been forged in the crucible of personal tragedy. Martin Jordan, Hal's father, had been a test pilot himself, one of the pioneering aviators who helped establish the protocols and safety measures that would save countless lives in the decades to follow. Young Hal had watched from the observation deck as his father's experimental aircraft suffered catastrophic engine failure during what should have been a routine test flight. The explosion that followed had been visible for miles, a pillar of fire and smoke that marked the end of a hero's career and the beginning of a son's obsession with conquering the sky. Most children who witnessed such trauma would have developed a healthy fear of aviation. Hal Jordan developed an almost pathological need to prove that his father's death had meaning, that the risks of test piloting were justified by the advances they made possible. Every flight became a tribute to Martin Jordan's memory. Every successful mission a small victory against the chaos that had claimed his father's life. Hal didn't just want to be a pilot, he needed to be a pilot, to transform his personal tragedy into a force that would advance human understanding of flight. The irony was not lost on those who knew Hal's history. A man driven by his refusal to accept his father's death had become someone who courted death with almost casual regularity. His colleagues at Edwards noted that Hal seemed most alive when facing the greatest danger, most focused when the margin for error had essentially disappeared. He possessed the peculiar combination of technical expertise and intuitive recklessness that made great test pilots, and occasionally, great heroes. On the day that would change not just Hal's life, but the course of cosmic history, he was preparing for the test flight of an experimental aircraft designed to push the boundaries of atmospheric flight. The prototype represented the cutting edge of human aerospace technology, incorporating innovations that would eventually lead to the development of spacecraft capable of interplanetary travel. It was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed to Hal's particular combination of skill and audacity. But 47 light-years away, in a sector of space designated by the Guardians as 2814, events were unfolding that would make human aerospace achievements seem quaint by comparison. Abin Sur, the Green Lantern assigned to patrol that vast region of space, was engaged in a desperate battle against an enemy whose nature defied conventional understanding. Abin Sur had served the Green Lantern Corps for over 2 centuries, establishing himself as one of its most reliable and skilled members. The purple-skinned humanoid from the planet Ungara had participated in countless missions, faced threats that ranged from interplanetary dictators to cosmic entities, and earned the respect of both his fellow Lanterns and the Guardians themselves. His sector patrol had been marked by decades of relative peace, broken only by the occasional pirate raid or territorial dispute between neighboring worlds. But the enemy that now pursued him across the void was unlike anything in his extensive experience. Legion was its name, a creature of living shadow that fed on fear and grew stronger with each victory. This was not merely a powerful villain, but something far more dangerous, a manifestation of the yellow light of fear that had somehow achieved independent existence without the constraints that bound the other emotional entities. The battle had been raging for hours across multiple star systems, a running fight that showcased both Abin Sur's tactical brilliance and Legion's relentless hunger. The Green Lantern's constructs, energy weapons of crystalline precision, protective barriers that could withstand the impact of asteroids, transportation vehicles that moved faster than most starships, had proven insufficient against an enemy that seemed to draw strength from the very act of being fought. Every blast of green energy that struck Legion's shadowy form was absorbed and transformed, feeding the creature's power while depleting Abin Sur's ring charge. Every construct the veteran Lantern created was eventually overwhelmed and destroyed, adding to the psychological pressure that made Legion stronger. Worst of all, Abin Sur could feel his own confidence beginning to erode as the prolonged battle took its toll. For the first time in decades of service, the Green Lantern of Sector 2814 began to experience something he had not felt since his earliest days in the Corps: genuine fear for his own survival. The fear was exactly what Legion had been cultivating. This creature understood that the green light of will was most vulnerable when its bearer began to doubt their ability to overcome the obstacles before them. By creating a seemingly hopeless situation, by forcing Abin Sur into a prolonged battle of attrition, Legion was not just trying to defeat a single Green Lantern, it was attempting to corrupt the very will that powered the ring. As Abin Sur's ring charge dropped below 20%, the experienced Lantern made a decision that would echo across cosmic history. Rather than continue a fight he could not win, rather than risk allowing Legion to claim his ring and use it to spread fear throughout the sector, he would ensure that his power passed to a worthy successor. Using the last of his ring's charge, Abin Sur programmed it to scan the surrounding space for beings who possessed the will necessary to replace him. The scan swept across multiple star systems, analyzing billions of potential candidates according to criteria established by the Guardians eons earlier. Most beings failed immediately. They lacked either the necessary courage or the fundamental willpower required to wield cosmic forces. Others possessed the basic qualifications but carried psychological flaws or moral compromises that made them unsuitable for the responsibility of universal law enforcement. But on the third planet orbiting a yellow star in a system the inhabitants called Sol, the ring's sensors detected something remarkable. One being among the billions on that world exhibited willpower that registered at the very top of the acceptable range. More importantly, this being had repeatedly demonstrated the ability to overcome fear through determination, to transform personal tragedy into motivation for protecting others, to risk his own life in service of advancing knowledge that would benefit his entire species. Abin Sur's ring had found Hal Jordan. The dying Green Lantern used his remaining power to alter course toward Earth, his ship's systems failing one by one as Legion's final attack overwhelmed his defenses. The crash landing in the American Southwest was barely controlled, leaving wreckage scattered across miles of desert and Abin Sur himself mortally wounded. But the ring had done its work. It had guided them to within proximity of the human it had selected as the next Green Lantern of Sector 2814. When Hal Jordan received the emergency signal redirecting him from his scheduled test flight to investigate an unidentified crash site, he assumed he was responding to a downed military aircraft. The possibility that he was about to encounter technology from beyond Earth's solar system never entered his mind. The idea that an alien being was dying in the desert, waiting to pass cosmic responsibility to a test pilot from California, was so far outside human experience that even Hal's considerable imagination could not have conceived it. The sight that greeted him in the crash crater defied every assumption about humanity's place in the universe. The ship was clearly artificial, but designed according to aesthetic principles that no human engineer had ever imagined. Its occupant was unmistakably intelligent, unmistakably dying, and unmistakably not from Earth. When Abin Sur spoke, The ring automatically translated his words into English, creating the surreal experience of hearing an alien voice speaking in perfectly familiar language. "Fear, not death," Abin-Sur whispered, his purple blood seeping into the desert sand. "Fear, what comes after. The ring chose you. Willpower, strongest of all emotions. You must take it. Must protect this sector." The ring floating above Abin-Sur's dying form pulsed with green light that seemed to call to something deep within Hal's consciousness. This was not technology, as humans understood it. This was power made manifest, responsibility given physical form, destiny wrapped in a simple band of metal that somehow contained the energy output of entire stars. When Hal reached out to touch it, the ring responded immediately, sliding onto his finger as if it had been waiting his entire life for this moment. The transformation was instantaneous and overwhelming. Green energy cascaded over Hal's body, replacing his flight suit with a uniform of emerald light that fit him perfectly, despite having been designed by alien minds for an alien physique. More importantly, knowledge flooded his consciousness, understanding of the ring's capabilities, awareness of his new responsibilities, and the terrible realization that he was now part of something vast beyond human comprehension. Hal Jordan of Earth. The ring's artificial intelligence spoke directly into his mind, its voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "You have been chosen to join the Green Lantern Corps. Your will has been measured and found worthy. Your sector assignment is 2814, containing 600 inhabited worlds, including your homeworld of Earth. You will swear the oath and take your place among the guardians of the universe." As Abin-Sur's final breath left his body, Hal Jordan spoke words that bound him to a destiny he could never have imagined. "In brightest day, in blackest night, no evil shall escape my sight. Let those who worship evils might beware my power, Green Lantern's light." The oath resonated through the ring and across the cosmos, announcing to the Guardians on Oa that Sector 2814 had a new protector. But it also served as a declaration to forces that opposed Cosmic Order Legion, among them that their newest enemy was not just another Green Lantern, but a being whose willpower had been forged in the crucible of human determination and tested in the fires of personal loss. Hal Jordan, test pilot and son of a fallen aviator, had become something unprecedented, Earth's first Green Lantern. He carried with him not just the power of the ring, but the accumulated hopes and dreams of a species that had always looked to the stars and wondered what lay beyond their reach. Humanity was about to discover that the universe was far more dangerous, far more wondrous, and far more in need of protection than they had ever dared imagine. But Hal Jordan was also about to discover that wielding cosmic power was only the beginning of his challenges. The ring had chosen him for his willpower, but will alone would not be sufficient for the trials ahead. He would need to learn to balance human emotion with cosmic responsibility, to transform his earthly perspective into something capable of protecting civilizations he could never fully understand. Most importantly, he would need to prove that humanity deserved its place among the Green Lantern Corps, not just as recipients of protection, but as protectors themselves. Earth had produced something the Guardians had not expected, a being whose willpower was enhanced rather than diminished by emotional connection, whose strength came not from abandoning human feeling, but from channeling it toward cosmic good. The universe was about to learn what could be accomplished when human determination was given the tools to reshape reality itself. In the annals of cosmic history, few transformations have been as profound or as devastating as the fall of SINESTRO, from greatest Green Lantern to architect of fear itself. His story serves as both inspiration and warning proof that even the most noble intentions can be corrupted when power becomes divorced from compassion, when order becomes more important than the lives it was meant to protect. Sinestro's origin lay not in tragedy or accident, but in the methodical pursuit of perfection that would ultimately become his greatest weakness. Born on the technologically advanced world of KORUGAR, he emerged from a society that prized discipline, efficiency, and rational thought above all other virtues. Korugarian civilization had evolved beyond the chaotic emotional excess that plagued many worlds, creating a stable, ordered society where crime was virtually unknown, and social conflict had been eliminated through careful application of logic and law. From childhood, Sinestro demonstrated the qualities that would make him an ideal candidate for the Green Lantern Corps. He possessed an analytical mind, capable of breaking down complex problems into manageable components, unwavering determination that refused to accept defeat, and most importantly, an absolute commitment to justice that burned with the intensity of his homeworld's twin suns. When the Ring found him during his service as KORUGAR's premier law enforcement officer, it was selecting not just a being of exceptional will, but someone who had already dedicated his life to maintaining order in an often chaotic universe. The early years of Sinestro's service to the Corps were marked by achievements that would become legendary among his fellow Lanterns. His sector, which included several notoriously unstable regions of space, experienced an unprecedented period of peace under his protection. Pirates who had terrorized trade routes for generations found themselves systematically hunted down and captured. Corrupt governments discovered that their crimes could not be hidden from the penetrating green light of Lantern scrutiny. Warlords who had built empires on the suffering of innocents learned that their weapons were useless against a being whose will could reshape reality itself. But it was not just Sinestro's effectiveness that impressed his fellow Corps members, it was his innovation. Where other Green Lanterns relied on brute force constructs or simple energy projections, Sinestro created works of art that served as instruments of justice. His constructs were marvels of geometric precision, crystalline structures that demonstrated not just power, but an aesthetic sense that elevated law enforcement to a form of cosmic sculpture. Watching Sinestro work was like observing a master craftsman who happened to possess the power of a god. The Guardians of the Universe took particular notice of this remarkable Green Lantern, recognizing in him qualities that reminded them of their own commitment to cosmic order. Here was a being who understood that chaos was the universe's natural state, that only through constant vigilance and unwavering determination could civilization be maintained against the forces that sought to tear it down. When they needed a mentor for new recruits, particularly those from species that had not yet learned to balance emotion with responsibility, Sinestro was their natural choice. It was in this capacity that Sinestro first encountered Hal Jordan, the impetuous human whose selection as Green Lantern had raised eyebrows throughout the Corps. Earth was a primitive world by galactic standards, its inhabitants barely capable of interplanetary travel and possessed of emotional volatility that made them seem unsuited for cosmic responsibility. That such a species had produced a ring-bearer was surprising. That the Ring had chosen someone as undisciplined as Hal Jordan was almost scandalous. Sinestro's initial assessment of his new pupil was not encouraging. Jordan possessed the willpower necessary to activate the Ring, but he lacked the refined control and philosophical understanding that Sinestro considered essential for proper use of such power. The human's constructs were crude, functional affairs that accomplished their objectives through brute force rather than elegant efficiency. His approach to law enforcement was reactive rather than proactive, responding to crises rather than preventing them through careful planning and systematic deterrence. Yet as their partnership developed, Sinestro began to recognize qualities in Jordan that he had not initially appreciated. The human's emotional nature, which Sinestro had dismissed as primitive, actually enhanced his connection to the green light in ways that pure logic could not. Jordan's willpower was not diminished by his feelings, it was strengthened by them, fueled by genuine care for the beings he protected and real anger at injustice. This emotional enhancement allowed Jordan to achieve power levels that impressed even veteran Lanterns, creating constructs of surprising complexity and maintaining ring charge under circumstances that would have drained other bearers. More troubling for Sinestro was Jordan's approach to justice itself. Where Sinestro sought to eliminate crime through systematic deterrence and comprehensive law enforcement, Jordan seemed more interested in understanding why crimes occurred and addressing their root causes. The human would spend hours talking with criminals and victims alike, trying to comprehend the social and psychological factors that led to conflict. This approach was inefficient and emotionally draining, but it also resulted in solutions that lasted longer and created fewer unintended consequences. The differences between mentor and student came to a head during their investigation of unrest on the mining world of Quord. Sinestro's analysis of the situation was characteristically thorough. The planet's workers were being exploited by off-world corporations. Their working conditions were deliberately dangerous to maximize profit, and their attempts at peaceful protest had been met with violent suppression. The solution was obvious: remove the corrupt corporate leadership, establish fair labor practices, and maintain a Green Lantern presence to ensure compliance. Jordan's approach was typically chaotic. Rather than simply imposing order from above, he insisted on listening to both workers and management, understanding the economic pressures that had created the situation, and finding solutions that addressed everyone's legitimate concerns. The process was messy, time-consuming, and required Jordan to navigate emotional complexities that Sinestro found both unnecessary and dangerous. But Jordan's method worked. Not only did the immediate crisis resolve, but the solutions they implemented created a framework for ongoing cooperation that eliminated the need for future Green Lantern intervention. The workers received fair treatment without destroying the economic viability of the mining operation. The corporations learned that short-term profit was less valuable than long-term stability, and the planet developed its own mechanisms for resolving conflicts before they escalated to violence. For Sinestro, this success was both impressive and deeply disturbing. Jordan had achieved better results through emotional engagement than Sinestro had through logical analysis. The implications were troubling. If emotion could enhance rather than compromise the effectiveness of Green Lantern power, then perhaps Sinestro's entire philosophical approach needed re-examination. The crisis that would define their relationship and ultimately lead to Sinestro's fall began with reports of increasing crime and social disorder on KORUGAR itself. This was particularly troubling for Sinestro, who had regarded his homeworld as proof that rational order could triumph over chaotic emotion. The idea that KORUGAR might be experiencing the kind of problems he spent his time solving on primitive worlds was both personally embarrassing and philosophically threatening. Investigation revealed a situation more complex than Sinestro had initially understood. In his absence, serving the Green Lantern Corps across the galaxy, KORUGAR's government had gradually become more authoritarian, using Sinestro's reputation as justification for increasingly harsh measures against any form of dissent. Citizens who questioned government policies were branded as potential criminals. Social nonconformity was treated as a form of mental illness requiring treatment. Creative expression that deviated from approved norms was suppressed as dangerous to social stability. The population had not rebelled against these measures because they had been implemented in Sinestro's name. The Green Lantern was held up as the perfect example of Korugarian achievement, a being who had transcended the emotional chaos that plagued lesser species and achieved a level of rational perfection that made him worthy of cosmic responsibility. If Sinestro approved of authoritarian measures, the reasoning went, then those measures must represent the highest form of civilized behavior. Sinestro's response to this revelation would determine not just his own fate, but the future of an entire world. He could acknowledge that his pursuit of order had enabled tyranny, that his emphasis on rational control had created a society where rational control was used to justify oppression. He could work with Jordan and others to find ways of maintaining Korugarian stability while allowing for the kind of individual expression and emotional authenticity that made life worth living. Instead, Sinestro made a choice that would echo across cosmic history. He looked at Korugar's authoritarian system and decided that it worked. Crime was virtually non-existent, social disorder had been eliminated, and the population was peaceful and productive. The fact that this peace was maintained through fear and repression was not a flaw in the system, it was a feature. Fear, Sinestro realized, was not the enemy of order but its most reliable ally. The philosophical shift was subtle at first. Sinestro began incorporating fear-based tactics into his law enforcement activities, reasoning that criminals who truly feared the consequences of their actions would be less likely to commit crimes in the first place. His constructs became more intimidating, designed not just to apprehend criminals, but to terrify them into compliance. His reputation began to precede him. Worlds under his protection experienced unprecedented peace, but it was the peace of the terrified rather than the peace of the just. Jordan was among the first to notice the change in his mentor, but Sinestro dismissed the human's concerns as typical emotional excess. Fear was simply another tool in the Green Lantern arsenal, Sinestro argued, and using it effectively was no different from using willpower or determination. If criminals feared Green Lantern justice, that only proved the system was working as intended. The breaking point came when Jordan witnessed Sinestro's protection of KORUGAR firsthand. The world that Sinestro had held up as an example of perfect order was revealed to be a police state where citizens lived in constant fear of their protector's displeasure. Sinestro had not prevented crime by addressing its causes. He had eliminated it by making the consequences so terrible that no one dared to risk them. The confrontation between mentor and student was inevitable, but its outcome surprised both participants. Jordan, whose emotional nature Sinestro had always dismissed as weakness, proved capable of defeating the more experienced Lantern through sheer determination to protect innocent life. Sinestro, whose rational approach had always given him tactical advantages, found himself overwhelmed by an opponent whose will was enhanced rather than compromised by genuine moral outrage. The Guardian's verdict was swift and absolute. Sinestro was stripped of his ring and exiled to the antimatter universe of Q-Ward, a realm where the fundamental forces that powered Green Lantern technology were reversed and perverted. It was intended as both punishment and rehabilitation, a place where Sinestro would have time to reflect on his failures and perhaps find a path back to the principles he had abandoned. Instead, Q-Ward became the place where Sinestro discovered his true calling. In a universe where fear was literally a source of power, where yellow energy could be harnessed just as effectively as green, the former Green Lantern found beings who shared his vision of order through terror. The weaponers of Q-Ward were master craftsmen who had spent eons perfecting instruments of fear, and in Sinestro they found a being whose understanding of law enforcement could be adapted to serve their antimatter philosophy. The yellow ring they created for him was both tribute and transformation. Where the Green Lantern ring channeled willpower, the yellow ring channeled fear, not just the bearer's fear, but the fear of everyone who encountered its terrible light. Sinestro had found a power source that aligned perfectly with his evolved philosophy: justice through terror, order through intimidation, peace through the absolute certainty that resistance would be met with overwhelming force. When Sinestro returned to confront his former student and colleagues, he came not as a reformed exile seeking redemption, but as something entirely new, the first of what would become known as Yellow Lanterns, wielders of fear who sought to impose their vision of order upon a chaotic universe. The Green Lantern Corps had created their greatest enemy not through malice or accident, but through the corruption of their own highest ideals. The universe would soon learn that fear could be just as powerful as will, and far more seductive to those who believed that peace was worth any price. The selection of Hal Jordan as the first human Green Lantern had been intended by the Guardians as an experimental expansion of core diversity, a test to determine whether Earth's primitive but emotionally complex species could contribute meaningfully to cosmic law enforcement. What they had not anticipated was that this single recruitment would transform their entire understanding of how power rings selected worthy bearers. Earth, it seemed, possessed something that made it uniquely suited to producing Green Lanterns, a quality that would elevate humanity from cosmic newcomers to one of the Corps' most essential and reliable sources of talent. The phenomenon became apparent within months of Hal's recruitment. Ring-bearing casualties in active service, while always tragic, were an inevitable reality of cosmic law enforcement. When veteran Lanterns fell in the line of duty, their rings would automatically begin scanning for replacement bearers according to the same criteria that had guided their original selection. But instead of identifying worthy candidates spread across multiple sectors as was typical, several rings found themselves drawn repeatedly to the same small blue world that had produced Hal Jordan. The first of these subsequent selections came during a crisis that would have tested even veteran Corps members. When a power-mad dictator on the mining world of Maltus Prime seized control of ancient Oan technology and used it to create gravitational weapons capable of destroying entire star systems, the Green Lantern assigned to that sector fell in battle before the threat could be neutralized. His ring, programmed to find a replacement capable of completing his final mission, scanned across light years of space before settling on an unlikely candidate. Guy Gardner was everything that Hal Jordan was not. where Hal was a disciplined military officer who had learned to channel his aggressive instincts into precise flying techniques. Guy was a special education teacher from Baltimore, whose confrontational personality had been shaped by a childhood spent protecting younger siblings from neighborhood bullies. Where Hal's willpower manifested as quiet determination to overcome obstacles, Guy's expressed itself as loud, stubborn refusal to back down from any challenge, regardless of the odds. The ring's selection of Guy Gardner initially puzzled both the Guardians and the Corps' more experienced members. Guy lacked Hal's technical training, his understanding of military hierarchy, and his instinctive grasp of when diplomatic solutions might be preferable to direct confrontation. What Guy possessed in abundance was something that proved equally valuable: an absolute commitment to protecting those who could not protect themselves. Backed by willpower that had been forged in urban schools, where teachers faced daily battles against indifference, violence, and systematic underfunding, Guy's approach to Green Lantern duties reflected his background as an educator and protector of society's most vulnerable members. Where other lanterns might focus on major interplanetary conflicts or cosmic-scale threats, Guy consistently gravitated towards situations where ordinary beings were being oppressed by those with greater power. His constructs, while lacking Hal's aeronautical precision or Sinestro's geometric elegance, possessed a quality that resonated with victims of injustice. They were obviously created by someone who understood what it felt like to be powerless and refused to accept that condition as permanent. The success of Guy's unorthodox methods forced the Guardians to reconsider their assumptions about what qualities made an ideal Green Lantern. Perhaps the Corps needed not just beings of exceptional will, but beings whose will had been tested in the specific crucible of protecting others despite personal risk. Perhaps the diversity that the Guardians had initially sought for practical reasons was actually essential for philosophical ones. Different types of willpower were needed to address different types of injustice. This understanding proved prophetic when another ring sought a replacement bearer on Earth, this time selecting someone whose qualifications seemed to contradict everything the Corps thought they knew about willpower. John Stewart was an architect and former Marine whose careful, methodical approach to both design and combat stood in stark contrast to the aggressive confidence that characterized most ring bearers. Where typical Green Lanterns succeeded through bold action and unwavering determination, John achieved his goals through patient planning and careful consideration of consequences. John's background as both a creator and a warrior gave him a unique perspective on the Green Lantern mission. His architectural training taught him to see the universe as a series of structures that could be improved through careful design and patient construction. His military experience had shown him that the most effective solutions to complex problems were often the least dramatic ones: careful preparation and systematic execution, rather than heroic gestures and last-minute improvisation. These qualities manifested in John's use of the power ring in ways that impressed even veteran Corps members. His constructs were marvels of engineering precision, stable structures that could function independently for extended periods, rather than requiring constant concentration to maintain. More importantly, John approached each mission as both a tactical challenge and a design problem. How could the situation be resolved in a way that created lasting stability rather than temporary peace? The pattern was becoming clear to observers both within and outside the Green Lantern Corps. Earth was producing ring-bearers who brought different types of willpower to cosmic law enforcement, different approaches to justice that complemented and enhanced each other's effectiveness. Hal's military precision, Guy's protective instincts, and John's architectural patience represented different facets of human determination that proved equally valuable in different circumstances. But it was the fourth human selection that truly demonstrated how unique Earth's contribution to the Corps had become. When Kyle Rayner received his ring under circumstances that would have been traumatic for any being, the near-complete destruction of the Corps and the death of almost every Green Lantern in existence, he brought qualities that no previous ring-bearer had possessed. Kyle was an artist, a being whose primary focus was the creation of beauty rather than the maintenance of order. His willpower was not forged in military discipline or protective instincts, but in the relentless pursuit of creative vision, despite a universe that often seemed indifferent to artistic achievement. Kyle's approach to wielding the power ring revolutionized core understanding of what the devices could accomplish. Where previous lanterns had created functional constructs designed to serve specific tactical purposes, Kyle created works of art that happened to be functional. His ring constructs possessed aesthetic beauty that served no practical purpose, yet somehow made them more effective at their intended tasks. Watching Kyle work was like observing the universe's creative force, given physical form and directed toward the protection of innocent life. The implications of Kyle's success were profound. The power rings, which the Guardians had designed as tools for imposing order upon chaos, proved equally capable of channeling creativity and imagination. The green light of will could power not just weapons and vehicles, but genuine art that inspired hope in those who witnessed it. Kyle demonstrated that the line between creation and protection was artificial. True guardianship required not just the will to fight evil, but the imagination to envision something better. The 4 human Green Lanterns represented a spectrum of human determination that no single species had ever contributed to the core. Hal embodied the will to overcome obstacles through skill and training. Guy represented the will to protect others despite personal cost. John demonstrated the will to build lasting solutions rather than temporary fixes. Kyle showed the will to create beauty in the face of destruction. Together, they proved that Earth's contribution to the Green Lantern Corps was not accidental or temporary, but fundamental to the organization's mission. Humanity had evolved in an environment that required multiple types of willpower for survival: the determination to explore dangerous frontiers, the stubbornness to protect family and community, the patience to build complex civilizations, and the creativity to imagine better futures. These qualities, when channeled through power rings, created Green Lanterns, whose effectiveness exceeded what any single approach could achieve. The Guardians, in their analytical way, attempted to quantify what made Earth so uniquely suited to producing ring-bearers. Their studies revealed certain characteristics that distinguished human psychology from that of most spacefaring species. Humans had evolved under conditions that required constant adaptation to changing circumstances, making them naturally flexible in their approach to problem-solving. Their relatively short lifespans created urgency that motivated achievement while preventing the stagnation that affected many immortal species. Most importantly, human evolution had occurred on a world where cooperation and competition existed in constant tension, producing beings who could work together effectively while maintaining the individual willpower necessary to make difficult decisions. But perhaps the most significant factor was humanity's relationship with failure. Most species that achieved spaceflight had done so by minimizing risk and following established protocols. Humans had reached for the stars despite a history of spectacular failures, learning from disasters rather than being paralyzed by them. This psychological resilience created beings who could maintain hope even in seemingly hopeless situations, who could continue fighting even when victory seemed impossible. The success of Earth's Green Lanterns also demonstrated the wisdom of the Guardians' decision to abandon their mechanical manhunters in favor of organic ring-bearers. The 4 humans showed that emotion, rather than compromising the effectiveness of cosmic law enforcement, actually enhanced it when properly channeled. Hal's fear for his father's memory motivated him to master flight techniques that saved countless lives. Guy's anger at injustice drove him to protect beings he had never met from threats he barely understood. John's love of order inspired him to create structures that brought stability to entire sectors. Kyle's joy in creation gave him the imagination necessary to envision solutions that pure logic could never have conceived. The Green Lantern Corps had entered what historians would later call its Emerald Age, a period when the organization achieved its greatest successes, not through the rigid adherence to protocol, but through the creative application of diverse forms of willpower to an equally diverse universe of challenges. Earth's Green Lanterns served as proof that the universe's chaotic nature was not a problem to be solved, but a resource to be harnessed, that the emotional complexity the Guardians had once feared was actually essential for true justice. But even as the Corps celebrated this golden age of effectiveness and innovation, dark forces were stirring in the depths of space. The same diversity that made humanity's ring-bearers so effective also made them vulnerable in ways that more homogeneous species were not. The emotional spectrum that powered the green light contained other energies, other emotions that had remained dormant during the early years of core dominance. These forces were beginning to awaken, drawn by the very success of Earth's Green Lanterns and the powerful emotions that fueled their unprecedented achievements. The universe was about to discover that will, no matter how strong, could not stand alone against the full spectrum of emotion forever. The Emerald Age was approaching its twilight, and with it would come challenges that would test not just individual Green Lanterns, but the fundamental philosophy upon which the entire core had been built. Fear was coming, and it wore a yellow ring. In the deepest vaults of Oa, where the Guardians stored artifacts too dangerous for mortal comprehension, something had been stirring for millennia. Sealed within the very heart of the central battery that powered the Green Lantern core lay an entity so ancient and malevolent that its true nature had been hidden even from most of the immortal beings who had imprisoned it. This was PARALLAX, the living embodiment of fear itself, the yellow shadow that had haunted the universe since consciousness first learned to dread the unknown. The entity's imprisonment was not the result of battle or conquest, but of a cosmic accident that had occurred during the early formation of the Green Lantern core. When the Guardians first harnessed the green light of will to power their rings, they had unknowingly created a beacon that drew the attention of fear's living avatar. PARALLAX had been drawn to Oa like a moth to flame, seeking to corrupt the very source of willpower that threatened its influence over the universe. The entity that approached Oa in those early days was not merely powerful, it was fear, given cosmic form. PARALLAX existed as a vast, shifting mass of yellow energy that defied physical laws, a creature whose very presence could reduce the mightiest heroes to cowering children. Its true horror lay not in its ability to inspire terror, but in its fundamental nature as the antithesis of everything the Green Lantern Corps represented. Where will sought to overcome obstacles, fear whispered that obstacles were insurmountable. Where determination built hope for better futures, terror proclaimed that only suffering awaited those brave enough to struggle against fate. The battle between PARALLAX and the assembled might of the early Green Lantern Corps had been brief but cataclysmic. Veteran Lanterns, who had faced cosmic destroyers and interdimensional conquerors, found themselves paralyzed by primal fears they thought they had conquered decades earlier. The creature's mere presence had been enough to drain power ring charges, as the willpower necessary to maintain constructs crumbled under the weight of existential dread. But the Guardians, in their immortal wisdom, had recognized that PARALLAX could not be destroyed. Fear was too fundamental an emotion, too essential to the survival instincts of organic life. Instead, they had devised a prison of unprecedented ingenuity. They would trap the entity within the very source of its opposite emotion. The central battery that powered every Green Lantern ring would become PARALLAX's cage, surrounded by such concentrated willpower that the creature would be held in eternal stasis. The plan had worked, but at a cost that the Guardians only gradually came to understand. PARALLAX's imprisonment had created an inherent weakness in the green light itself, a yellow impurity that made Green Lantern rings ineffective against anything colored yellow, the hue of fear made manifest. This limitation was not merely a technical flaw, but a psychological one. Deep in their subconscious, every ring bearer carried awareness that their power could not touch the color of their greatest enemy. For eons, this arrangement had maintained cosmic balance. The Green Lantern Corps protected the universe, while remaining perpetually reminded of their own limitations. PARALLAX slumbered in its emerald prison, its influence reduced to whispers that most lanterns never consciously heard. The yellow impurity became simply another challenge to overcome, proof that even cosmic power had boundaries that required wisdom and humility to navigate. But PARALLAX was not merely sleeping, it was learning. Every time a Green Lantern experienced fear, every moment of doubt or terror felt by a ring bearer anywhere in the universe, fed tiny amounts of energy to the imprisoned entity. These fragments of power were insufficient to break its bonds, but they allowed PARALLAX to study the modern Green Lantern Corps, to understand their strengths and identify their vulnerabilities. The entity paid particular attention to the human Green Lanterns, recognizing in them both opportunity and threat. Humans experienced fear more intensely than most species. Their short lifespans and emotional volatility making them natural conduits for the very energy that sustained Parallax. But they also transformed fear into motivation more effectively than other beings, using terror as fuel for heroic action rather than paralysis. This paradox made them simultaneously the most vulnerable and most dangerous opponents the entity had ever encountered. The crisis that would free Parallax began with an event that seemed like a triumph for everything the Green Lantern Corps represented. The cosmic villain known as Mongol had seized control of Warworld, a planet-sized weapon that posed an existential threat to entire sectors of space. When diplomatic solutions failed and direct assault proved impossible, the Guardians made the unprecedented decision to deploy their ultimate weapon. The combined might of the entire Green Lantern Corps focused through Hal Jordan's ring. The plan was audacious in its scope and elegant in its execution. Every power ring in existence would channel its energy through Hal's ring, creating a blast of concentrated willpower sufficient to shatter Warworld and end Mongol's threat permanently. It was exactly the kind of decisive action that proved the superiority of order over chaos, demonstrating that united will could overcome any obstacle. But the planners had not accounted for the psychological toll of wielding such power. As ring after ring channeled its energy through Hal Jordan, the human Green Lantern found himself connected not just to the collective will of his fellow Corps members, but to their fears, doubts, and suppressed terrors. The psychic feedback was overwhelming, thousands of different nightmares crashing through his consciousness simultaneously, each one a fragment of the fear that had been feeding Parallax for millennia. The moment of Warworld's destruction should have been Hal Jordan's greatest triumph. Instead, it became the key that unlocked Parallax's prison. The massive expenditure of green light energy, combined with the psychological chaos of channeling so many minds at once, created fractures in the central battery's containment systems. For the first time in eons, the entity of fear felt the bonds that held it beginning to weaken. Parallax did not escape immediately. That would have triggered every alarm system on Oa and brought the full attention of the Guardians to bear. Instead, the entity began to seep slowly into Hal Jordan's subconscious, a yellow infection spreading through the green light of his will. The process was subtle, gradual, designed to avoid detection until it was too late to reverse. The first signs of Parallax's influence were dismissed as post-traumatic stress from the Warworld mission. Hal began experiencing nightmares of unprecedented intensity, dreams where he watched helplessly as everyone he had ever tried to protect suffered horrible deaths. His ring constructs occasionally flickered yellow around the edges, a phenomenon attributed to residual energy from the massive power channeling he had undergone. Most troubling, Hal began to second-guess decisions that he would previously have made instinctively, paralyzed by visions of how his actions might lead to unintended consequences. The corruption accelerated when Hal returned to Earth to discover that his hometown of Coast City had been completely destroyed during his absence. 7 million people, friends, colleagues, innocent civilians, whose protection was his primary responsibility, had been murdered by the alien tyrant, cyborg Superman, while Hal was off playing cosmic policeman. The guilt was devastating enough for any normal being. For someone infected by Parallax's influence, it became an existential weapon. The entity whispered seductively in Hal's mind, its voice indistinguishable from his own thoughts. The Green Lantern Corps had failed in its most basic duty, protecting innocent life. The Guardians, for all their cosmic wisdom, had proven incapable of preventing genocide on a member world. Hal himself, despite possessing the most powerful weapon in the universe, had been unable to save the people who mattered most to him. But Parallax offered a solution. The power of fear, properly channeled, could accomplish what will alone could not. Fear could motivate beings to make the difficult choices necessary for true protection. Fear could prevent conflicts before they started by making potential aggressors too terrified to act. Most seductively, fear combined with will could potentially reverse even death itself, the ultimate expression of power over the chaos that plagued organic existence. The transformation of Hal Jordan into Parallax's primary agent was not a sudden fall from grace, but a gradual descent into well-intentioned extremism. Each step seemed logical, each escalation justified by the failure of more moderate approaches. When the Guardians refused to authorize the use of Green Lantern power to resurrect Coast City's victims, Hal concluded that their commitment to cosmic law was more important to them than individual lives. When his fellow Corps members tried to stop him from taking the power necessary to right this cosmic injustice, he saw their interference as proof that they cared more about rules than results. The assault on Oa that followed was not the random violence of a madman, but the systematic methodology of someone who had concluded that the entire Green Lantern system was fundamentally flawed. Hal Jordan, fully possessed by Parallax but believing himself to be acting according to his own moral convictions, systematically defeated every Green Lantern who tried to stop him. Each victory fed more power to the entity controlling him, each fallen comrade proof that his former allies were too weak to do what justice truly required. The final confrontation in the central battery chamber was both climax and anticlimax. The Guardians, those immortal beings who had shaped cosmic law for billions of years, proved as vulnerable to fear as any mortal creature when faced with the full power of Parallax made manifest. Hal Jordan, his uniform now predominantly yellow rather than green, absorbed their life forces with the casual efficiency of someone pruning a garden. In his possessed mind, he was not committing murder, but eliminating obstacles to universal peace. When the slaughter was complete, when the Green Lantern Corps lay in ruins and the Guardians' wisdom had been reduced to memory, Parallax as Hal Jordan surveyed his work with satisfaction. The universe would no longer be protected by beings too weak to make difficult choices, too bound by arbitrary rules to achieve true justice. Fear would succeed where will had failed, and order would be imposed through the simple expedient of making chaos too terrifying to contemplate. But even possessed by cosmic fear incarnate, Hal Jordan retained enough of his essential nature to be troubled by what he had done. The guilt and horror that Parallax fed upon also created psychological resistance to the entity's complete control. Deep in his subconscious, the real Hal Jordan continued to fight against the yellow infection that had transformed him into everything he had once opposed. This internal struggle would prove to be Parallax's ultimate weakness. The entity had chosen a host whose willpower was too strong to be completely suppressed, whose moral convictions were too deeply rooted to be entirely corrupted. The very qualities that had made Hal Jordan an exceptional Green Lantern made him an imperfect vessel for cosmic fear. The universe now faced a threat, unlike any in its history, a being with the power of a god and the twisted morality of absolute conviction, capable of remaking reality according to a vision where fear served as the foundation for cosmic peace. The Green Lantern Corps was gone, the Guardians were dead, and the only hope for countless civilizations lay in the possibility that somewhere within the yellow-clad tyrant who had once been Hal Jordan, a spark of genuine heroism still survived. The Age of Fear had begun, and with it would come trials that would test whether the universe's capacity for hope could survive when confronted by terror given cosmic form. In the aftermath of cosmic catastrophe, when the Green Lantern Corps lay shattered and the universe reeled from the loss of its greatest protectors, hope arrived in the most unlikely form imaginable. Not as a warrior hardened by battle, not as a scientist armed with cosmic knowledge, not as a leader born to command armies, but as a struggling artist from Los Angeles, whose greatest concern had been meeting his rent payments while pursuing the impossible dream of making a living through creative expression. Kyle Rayner's selection as the universe's final Green Lantern was perhaps the most improbable recruitment in the Corps' history. The ring that found him one of the few power rings to survive Parallax's rampage through Oa had been programmed with desperation protocols that broadened its selection criteria far beyond the usual parameters. With the central battery destroyed and the Guardian hierarchy eliminated, the ring was forced to operate on minimal power while searching for any being capable of channeling the green light effectively. The scanning process that led to Kyle was both random and inevitable. The ring had detected the massive psychic trauma radiating from Earth, following Coast City's destruction, recognizing in that collective grief and determination the kind of emotional resonance that might sustain a power ring even without connection to Oa's infrastructure. But instead of selecting one of the obvious candidates, military leaders, emergency responders, or other traditional heroes, the ring was drawn to something entirely different. Kyle Rayner possessed willpower, but not the kind that military analysts could quantify or psychologists could easily categorize. His determination was the quiet persistence of someone who continued creating art despite a world that seemed indifferent to beauty, who maintained hope for artistic recognition despite years of rejection and financial struggle. This was not the dramatic willpower of someone conquering fear or overcoming physical obstacles, but the subtler strength of someone who refused to abandon his vision of what life could be, even when reality consistently proved hostile to that vision. The night that changed cosmic history began as just another evening in Kyle's ordinary struggle for artistic survival. He was walking home from his job at a graphics design firm, where he spent his days creating advertisements for products he didn't believe in, using his artistic skills to sell things rather than express truths. His portfolio of original artwork, paintings, drawings, and digital creations that represented his real passion was tucked under his arm, recently rejected by yet another gallery that claimed his work was too fantastical for current market trends. The encounter with Ganthet, the last surviving guardian of the universe, occurred in an alley that Kyle had walked through hundreds of times without incident. The blue-skinned immortal materialized from shadows that had been empty moments before, his ancient face bearing the weight of cosmic tragedy. In his hands, Ganthet held humanity's last hope, a power ring that pulsed with diminished but still viable green energy. "The core is finished," Ganthet spoke, his voice carrying the exhaustion of someone who had witnessed the end of everything he had spent eternity building. "The Guardians are dead, Oa is destroyed, and the universe's greatest protector has become its greatest threat. But the green light endures, and it requires a bearer who can sustain it without the infrastructure we spent eons creating." Kyle's first reaction was the natural skepticism of someone whose artistic imagination had taught him to distinguish between fantasy and reality. The ring that Ganthet placed in his hands looked like an elaborate piece of costume jewelry, the kind of prop that might be used in a science fiction movie. Even when it slid onto his finger and began transforming his casual clothes into a uniform of emerald light, Kyle's mind struggled to process the impossibility of what was happening to him. The knowledge download that followed was overwhelming but incomplete. Unlike previous Green Lantern recruits who had received comprehensive orientation from established core infrastructure, Kyle's ring could only provide fragmented information about his new responsibilities. He learned that he was now the sole bearer of a cosmic force that had once powered thousands of protectors across the galaxy. He understood that his ring could create constructs limited only by his imagination and willpower. Most soberly, he realized that the universe's protection now rested entirely on his shoulders. Ganthet's parting words carried both encouragement and terrible burden. "You are not replacing the core, you are the core. Everything that the Green Lantern organization ever stood for now lives or dies with your choices. The ring chose you not because you are the strongest or the bravest, but because your willpower has been tested in ways that prepare you for this responsibility. Create wisely, Kyle Rayner of Earth." The transformation from struggling artist to cosmic protector was neither smooth nor immediate. Kyle's early attempts at Green Lantern duties were marked by inexperience that would have been charming if the stakes hadn't been so catastrophically high. His constructs, while functional, reflected his artistic training. Rather than military necessity, he created beautiful energy sculptures that happened to be effective weapons rather than efficient tools designed for specific tactical purposes. But Kyle's artistic background also gave him advantages that traditional military-trained lanterns had never possessed. His imagination was boundless, unconstrained by conventional thinking about how energy constructs should function or appear. Where other lanterns created hammers, swords, and guns, familiar tools adapted to cosmic scale, Kyle created entirely original solutions that combined aesthetic beauty with practical effectiveness. His battles became performances, his rescues transformed into works of kinetic art that inspired hope in those who witnessed them. More importantly, Kyle's approach to heroism was fundamentally different from the law enforcement model that had defined the Green Lantern Corps. He was not a space cop imposing order on chaos, but an artist attempting to create beauty in a universe that seemed determined to destroy it. This perspective led him to solutions that more traditional heroes might never have considered: diplomatic resolutions that treated conflicts as creative challenges, rescue operations that prioritized inspiration over efficiency, and confrontations with villains that sought to understand the aesthetic motivations behind their destructive impulses. The universe that Kyle inherited as his responsibility was far more dangerous than the one that had been protected by the full core. Criminal empires that had been held in check by the threat of Green Lantern intervention began expanding aggressively, sensing that the cosmic police force that had limited their activities was no longer operational. Interplanetary warlords emerged from hiding to claim territories that had been under core protection. Most dangerously, the cosmic balance that had been maintained by the green light's opposition to other emotional energies began to destabilize as yellow fear energy, now concentrated in PARALLAX, threatened to overwhelm the spectrum. Kyle's response to these challenges revealed both his strengths and the gaps in his preparation. He could handle individual crises with remarkable creativity and effectiveness, but he lacked the strategic training necessary to address systemic problems across multiple sectors of space. His artistic temperament made him deeply empathetic to suffering wherever he encountered it, but also left him vulnerable to emotional manipulation by enemies who understood how to exploit his compassion. The loneliness of his position was perhaps the greatest challenge Kyle faced. Previous Green Lanterns had been part of a brotherhood that spanned the galaxy, able to call upon colleagues for assistance, advice, and simple companionship. Kyle operated in isolation, making decisions that affected billions of lives without the benefit of institutional wisdom or peer consultation. The weight of cosmic responsibility, combined with the absence of any support network, created psychological pressures that would have broken most beings. But Kyle's artistic nature also provided him with coping mechanisms that more conventional heroes might have lacked. His creativity became a form of meditation, allowing him to process trauma and stress through the act of creation. When the burden of cosmic protection became overwhelming, Kyle would retreat into his art, creating constructs whose only purpose was beauty, elaborate light sculptures that served no tactical function but reminded him why the universe was worth protecting. The relationship between Kyle's artistic identity and his heroic responsibilities evolved into something unprecedented in Green Lantern history. Rather than viewing his creativity as separate from his cosmic duties, Kyle began to understand that artistry and protection were fundamentally the same activity. Both involved taking raw materials, whether physical media or green energy, and shaping them into something that elevated the experience of existence. Both required vision, persistence, and the willingness to fail repeatedly in pursuit of eventual success. This integration reached its culmination during Kyle's confrontation with Oblivion, a cosmic entity that sought to eliminate all creative expression from the universe. Where a traditional Green Lantern might have approached this threat as a military problem requiring tactical solutions, Kyle recognized it as an aesthetic challenge that demanded artistic response. The battle that followed was less a fight than a collaborative creation, with Kyle using his ring not to destroy Oblivion, but to transform the entity's nihilistic impulses into something constructive. The victory established Kyle's reputation not just as a capable Green Lantern, but as something entirely new, a cosmic protector whose primary weapon was inspiration rather than intimidation. Civilizations that had never heard of the Green Lantern Corps began to speak of the Torchbearer, the lone guardian whose emerald light carried hope across the darkest reaches of space. Artists throughout the galaxy found their work elevated by the knowledge that creativity itself was protected by someone who understood its true value. But Kyle's greatest challenge still lay ahead. The universe could not remain indefinitely protected by a single individual, no matter how dedicated or creative. The Green Lantern Corps needed to be rebuilt. The central battery required restoration, and most critically, the threat of parallax had to be addressed. These tasks would require not just artistic vision, but the kind of institutional knowledge and cosmic power that Kyle, for all his determination, could not provide alone. The seeds of that restoration were already beginning to take root, nurtured by Kyle's example and watered by the hope he had kindled throughout the galaxy. Former Green Lanterns thought lost began to emerge from hiding, drawn by rumors that the green light still shone somewhere in the universe. Ancient allies of the Corps started to organize, recognizing that the time for rebuilding might finally be at hand. Most importantly, on Earth itself, A familiar test pilot was beginning to remember something that cosmic fear had tried to make him forget who he had been before. Yellow light corrupted his will. The torch that RAYNER carried would soon pass to others, but the light he had kept burning in the universe's darkest hour would never be extinguished. He had proven that hope could survive even cosmic catastrophe, that creativity could triumph over destruction, and that sometimes the universe's salvation came not from its mightiest warriors, but from those who remembered why it was worth saving in the first place. The age of the single green lantern was drawing to a close, and with it would come the opportunity to rebuild something greater than what had been lost. A core that understood not just how to impose order, but how to nurture the beauty that made order worth maintaining. The process of redemption, when it finally began, started not with cosmic revelation or divine intervention, but with the quiet persistence of human memory refusing to be completely erased. Deep within the yellow-shrouded consciousness that had once been Hal Jordan, fragments of genuine will began to reassert themselves against the parasitic entity that had transformed him into an instrument of fear. These moments of clarity were brief and painful sudden flashes, where the real Hal remembered who he had been before PARALLAX twisted his noble intentions into cosmic tyranny. The catalyst for Hal's resurrection came from an unexpected source, the final night crisis that threatened to extinguish Earth's sun and plunge the solar system into eternal darkness. The cosmic entity known as the Sun Eater had arrived to consume the star that sustained all life on Hal's homeworld, creating an extinction-level threat that even PARALLAX's corrupted sense of justice could not ignore. For the first time since his fall, the possessed Green Lantern found himself facing a situation where fear and protection pointed toward the same solution. The battle against the Sun Eater required a sacrifice that even PARALLAX had not anticipated. To reignite Earth's dying star, someone with cosmic-level power would need to travel into the sun's core and restart the nuclear fusion process from within a mission that would certainly result in the death of whoever attempted it. For the entity of fear, this represented an unacceptable loss of its primary host. For Hal Jordan, it represented the first opportunity in years to perform a genuinely heroic act. The internal struggle that raged within PARALLAX during those final moments was invisible to outside observers but represented the most important battle in cosmic history. The entity had spent decades carefully suppressing Hal's genuine personality, feeding on his guilt, and amplifying his worst impulses until the line between host and parasite had become almost invisible. But the prospect of saving billions of innocent lives, the exact motivation that had originally driven Hal to become a Green Lantern, proved stronger than years of careful corruption. In the heart of Earth's sun, as cosmic forces tore at his very essence, Hal Jordan performed his greatest act of will. Not the creation of an elaborate construct or the defeat of a powerful enemy, but the simple decision to be himself rather than the thing that fear had made him. The yellow energy that had corrupted his ring for so long was burned away by stellar fire, leaving behind only the green light that had always been his true nature. PARALLAX, separated from its host and exposed to the purifying radiation of a star's core, found itself vulnerable for the first time in eons. The entity that had seemed invincible when bonded with a willing host proved fragile when faced with someone who genuinely chose sacrifice over self-preservation. The fear that had sustained it for millennia was consumed by something stronger, the human capacity to face death willingly in service of life. Hal Jordan died as he had lived as a protector. His sacrifice reignited Earth's sun and saved billions of lives. But more importantly, it proved that even cosmic corruption could be overcome by genuine willpower. The universe mourned the loss of its greatest Green Lantern, while simultaneously celebrating the redemption of someone who had fallen farther than anyone thought possible, yet still found the strength to climb back toward the light. But death, as the universe has a way of demonstrating, is not always permanent for those whose will burns bright enough to reshape reality itself. The Spectre, that cosmic entity of divine vengeance, had been seeking a host capable of tempering its harsh justice with human compassion. In Hal Jordan, a being who had experienced both the heights of heroism and the depths of corruption, the Spectre found exactly the kind of complex moral perspective it required. The partnership between Hal's spirit and the Spectre was unlike anything in cosmic history. Where the entity of vengeance had previously dispensed harsh justice with little regard for nuance or redemption, its union with Hal Jordan created something unprecedented: divine justice, informed by human understanding of the difference between evil and error, between corruption and confusion. Together, they became cosmic protectors who could distinguish between villains who deserved punishment and victims who required salvation. But even this partnership could not satisfy the deeper need that drove Hal's spirit. The Green Lantern Corps remained scattered and leaderless. Kyle Rayner continued to bear the impossible burden of solo cosmic protection, and the universe still suffered from the institutional damage that Parallax had inflicted. Hal's work as the Spectre's host was important, but it was not the work he had been born to do. Deep in his transformed consciousness, he remained fundamentally a Green Lantern whose true calling lay in rebuilding what he had helped destroy. The opportunity for true resurrection came through the machinations of an unexpected ally, Sinestro himself. The former Green Lantern turned Yellow Lantern had been observing the universe's slow recovery from Parallax's rampage with growing concern. Without a functioning Green Lantern Corps to oppose them, the forces of fear were running unchecked across the galaxy, creating chaos that even Sinestro's vision of order through terror could not contain. The universe needed the green light restored, not just for cosmic balance, but for Sinestro's own plans to succeed. Working through intermediaries and careful manipulation of events, Sinestro orchestrated a crisis that would require Hal Jordan's unique combination of Green Lantern knowledge and Spectre power to resolve. The plan was audacious in its scope and subtle in its execution. Create a situation where Hal would be forced to choose between his duties as the Spectre's host and his identity as a Green Lantern, knowing that the human's fundamental nature would ultimately assert itself. The crisis centered on the discovery that Parallax had not been completely destroyed in the Sun's core. Fragments of the entity had survived, scattering across the galaxy and slowly beginning to coalesce into new threats. These fear parasites were infecting potential hosts throughout the universe, creating dozens of mini-parallaxes that threatened to overwhelm the cosmic balance that Kyle Rayner's solo efforts were barely maintaining. The solution required someone who understood Parallax intimately, someone who had been bonded with the entity and survived the experience. More specifically, it required someone whose will was strong enough to contain the scattered fragments, while simultaneously purifying them of their corrupting influence. In all the universe, only one being possessed both the necessary knowledge and the power to attempt such a feat: Hal Jordan. The ritual that followed was part exorcism, part resurrection, and part cosmic rebalancing act. Using artifacts from Oa's ruins and power drawn from the scattered remains of other central batteries, a coalition of former Green Lanterns and cosmic entities worked to separate Hal's spirit from the Spectre, while simultaneously reconstructing his physical form from pure willpower. The process was unprecedented, and extraordinarily dangerous failure would not merely kill Hal again, but could potentially unravel the cosmic forces that maintained reality's stability. The moment of Hal's return was marked not by fanfare or celebration, but by the quiet satisfaction of someone coming home after a long and difficult journey. The uniform that materialized around his reconstructed form was the classic Green Lantern costume, unmarked by the yellow corruption that had once defined his fallen state. The ring that appeared on his finger was new yet familiar, forged from the same cosmic forces that had created the original core, but enhanced by hard-won knowledge of how power could be corrupted and how it might be redeemed. But Hal Jordan, who returned from death, was not the same being who had fallen to Parallax years earlier. His experience as both cosmic tyrant and divine agent had given him perspectives that no other Green Lantern had ever possessed. He understood intimately how noble intentions could be twisted into destructive action, how the pursuit of perfect justice could become the foundation for terrible injustice. Most importantly, he had learned that true strength came not from the absence of fear, but from the decision to act heroically despite that fear. The reunion with Kyle Rayner was both emotional and practical. The younger Green Lantern had carried the universe's protection alone for years, developing skills and perspectives that even veteran Corps members could admire. But he had also paid the psychological price of that isolation, bearing responsibilities that no single being should have to carry. Hal's return offered not just assistance, but validation proof that Kyle's lonely vigil had meaning, that his efforts to keep the green light burning had created the possibility for something greater to be rebuilt. Together, Hal and Kyle began the work of core reconstruction, with a wisdom that their predecessors had lacked. Rather than simply recreating the organization that Parallax had destroyed, they sought to build something better, a Green Lantern Corps that learned from past mistakes, while maintaining the core values that made it worth preserving. This new Corps would be more diverse in its recruitment, more flexible in its methods, and more aware of the emotional complexities that made cosmic law enforcement both necessary and dangerous. The process of finding and training new Green Lanterns became a careful balance between practical necessity and philosophical evolution. Each new recruit was evaluated not just for willpower and courage, but for the emotional intelligence necessary to wield cosmic power responsibly. The new Corps would include beings who had experienced failure and redemption, who understood that heroism was not the absence of weakness, but the decision to act despite that weakness. Hal's personal relationships within the reconstructed Corps were complicated by his history as Parallax. Many veteran Lanterns who had survived the Purge remembered him as both colleague and destroyer, someone who had once saved their lives and later tried to end them. Trust had to be rebuilt gradually, through consistent action rather than explanatory words. Hal understood that his redemption was not a single moment, but an ongoing process that would continue for as long as he wore the ring. The philosophical foundation of the new Green Lantern Corps reflected hard-won understanding of the relationship between power and responsibility. Where the original Corps had emphasized order and law enforcement, the reconstructed organization prioritized protection and service. Where the Guardians had once imposed their vision of cosmic justice from above, the new Corps operated through consensus and mutual support. Most importantly, where the old system had viewed emotion as a weakness to be controlled, the new approach recognized feeling as essential to understanding why protection mattered in the first place. Hal Jordan's return marked the beginning of a new chapter in cosmic history, one where redemption was possible even after the greatest failures, where institutions could learn from their mistakes and become stronger, and where the green light of will could shine brighter for having survived its darkest hour. The universe had its greatest protector back, but more importantly, it had gained a Green Lantern who understood that true heroism lay not in never falling, but in the determination to rise again when falling seemed final. The stage was set for conflicts that would test not just the new Corps' power, but its wisdom, challenges that would require both the traditional strength of will and the hard-won understanding that strength alone was not sufficient for true justice. The reconstruction of the Green Lantern Corps had restored cosmic balance, but it had also awakened forces that had slumbered in the universe's depths since the dawn of consciousness itself. The pure green light of will, burning brighter than ever through the reformed Corps, sent ripples across the emotional spectrum that resonated in dimensions beyond physical space. For eons, the other emotions had remained largely dormant, their energies scattered and unfocused. Now, inspired by will's triumphant resurrection, they began to coalesce into organizations that would challenge the Green Lantern's monopoly on cosmic law enforcement. The first to emerge from this emotional awakening was rage crimson red like the blood of martyrs, burning with the fury of every injustice that had ever gone unpunished. On the devastated world of Ryut, where an entire sector's population had been massacred by the robotic manhunters in the early days of Guardian rule, something stirred in the lake of blood that had replaced the planet's once pure water. Atrocitus, the last survivor of his species, had spent millennia nursing his hatred not just for the machines that had destroyed his world, but for the blue-skinned gods who had created those machines. The Red Lantern Corps that emerged from Atrocitus's rage was unlike any organization the universe had ever seen. Where other emotional energies required discipline and focus to channel effectively, rage was pure and primal, transforming its bearers into living weapons fueled by righteous fury. The Red Rings sought out beings who had suffered unimaginable loss, who carried within their hearts anger so profound that it burned away everything else. Fear, hope, love, even the instinct for self-preservation. Red Lanterns were not soldiers or peacekeepers. They were avatars of vengeance given cosmic form. Their constructs were crude, but devastatingly effective. Hammers of blood-red energy that could shatter mountains. Chains of rage that could bind even cosmic entities. Flames of fury that burned with the intensity of stellar cores. Most terrifyingly, their rage was literally infectious. Beings exposed to Red Lantern energy for extended periods found their own anger amplified until it consumed their rational thought entirely. The philosophy that drove the Red Lantern Corps was deceptively simple. The universe was filled with unpunished injustice, and those who perpetrated evil deserved to suffer for their crimes. Where Green Lanterns sought to maintain order through law enforcement and rehabilitation, Red Lanterns believed that true justice could only be achieved through the elimination of those who threatened innocent life. They were cosmic vigilantes, operating on a scale that made planetary governments tremble and galactic empires reconsider their more brutal policies. At the opposite end of the emotional spectrum, hope began to manifest as a gentle blue light that seemed almost fragile compared to the violent energies of other core. On the planet Odin, in a solar system where twin suns cast everything in shades of azure, an ancient being named Ganthet, the same guardian who had given Kyle Rayner his ring, worked alongside his partner Sade to forge something unprecedented. These two survivors of the Guardian Holocaust had spent years studying the emotional spectrum, concluding that the universe's salvation lay not in the dominance of any single emotion, but in the harmony between them. The Blue Lantern Corps they created was perhaps the most paradoxical of all the emotional organizations. Blue rings were virtually powerless when used alone, capable of little more than basic flight and environmental protection. But in the presence of Green Lantern energy, they became amplifiers of incredible potency. A Blue Lantern fighting alongside a Green Lantern could enhance their partner's power exponentially, while simultaneously dampening the rage of Red Lanterns and weakening the fear-based constructs of Yellow Lanterns. Saint Walker, the first Blue Lantern, embodied everything that hope represented. A former religious leader who had maintained his faith despite watching his homeworld slowly die from stellar cooling. Walker possessed the rare combination of absolute optimism and practical wisdom that made hope more than mere wishful thinking. His presence on any battlefield served as a beacon that inspired allies and reminded enemies that no darkness was permanent, no defeat was final, and no evil was ultimately stronger than the combined will of those who chose to resist it. The Blue Lantern philosophy was built around the conviction that the universe's problems stemmed not from insufficient power, but from insufficient cooperation. They believed that every being, regardless of their current moral state, retained the potential for redemption and growth. Blue Lanterns did not fight to defeat their enemies, but to transform them, using hope as a force that could reach even the most corrupted hearts and kindle the possibility of positive change. On the antimatter world of KORUGAR, where Sinestro had first discovered the yellow light of fear, other forces were stirring in response to the emotional awakening. The Indigo Tribe, as they would become known, represented compassion, the deep purple light that recognized suffering wherever it existed and sought to heal it through understanding rather than force. Unlike other corps that recruited beings who already possessed their target emotion, the Indigo Tribe sought out individuals who completely lacked compassion, forcibly indoctrinating them until empathy became their dominant characteristic. The process of becoming an Indigo Lantern was both gift and curse. Beings who had spent their lives causing suffering suddenly found themselves experiencing the pain they had inflicted on others, forced to feel every moment of anguish they had created. The psychological shock was so profound that most new recruits lost their original personalities entirely, becoming vessels for pure compassion who retained their memories but not their emotional connection to their past selves. Indigo Lanterns possessed the unique ability to channel the power of other emotional spectrum energies, effectively becoming living conduits for whatever energy was most needed in any given situation. An Indigo Lantern fighting alongside Green Lanterns could manifest will-based constructs. One facing Red Lanterns could generate hope energy to calm their rage. One confronting Yellow Lanterns could produce courage to overcome fear. This adaptability made them invaluable allies, but also unpredictable ones, as their actions were guided by compassion rather than strategy. The orange light of avarice manifested very differently from the other spectrum energies. While most emotions could be shared among multiple bearers, greed was inherently possessive. The orange energy would tolerate only a single wielder at a time. That wielder was Larfleeze, an ancient being whose hunger for possession had grown so profound that he had literally consumed his own core, transforming fallen orange lanterns into energy constructs that served his insatiable desire for more. Larfleeze's domain was a solar system that he had claimed as his personal treasure vault, filled with artifacts, beings, and entire planets that he had decided to add to his collection. The Orange Lantern core consisted entirely of constructs made from beings who had opposed Larfleeze and been absorbed into his ring, forced to serve the very greed that had destroyed them. These constructs retained their memories and personalities, but were compelled to seek out new treasures for their master, spreading avarice throughout the galaxy like a cosmic infection. The philosophy of the Orange Lanterns was simple. Everything in the universe belonged to Larfleeze, and any being who possessed something he wanted was committing theft by keeping it from him. This reasoning, while obviously self-serving, was backed by power that could literally steal the life force from opponents and add them to his ever-growing collection of possessions. At the far end of the spectrum, love manifested as the violet light of the star Sapphires, an organization that had existed in primitive form for eons, but now expanded its influence throughout the galaxy. Based on the planet Zamaron, the star Sapphires were primarily composed of the Zamarons themselves, female immortals who had once been part of the same species as the Guardians of the Universe, but had chosen to embrace emotion rather than suppress it. The star Sapphire core operated on the principle that love was the universe's most powerful force, capable of overcoming any obstacle and healing any wound. But their understanding of love was complex and sometimes troubling. They believed that true love sometimes required forcing beings to confront their deepest feelings, even when those beings preferred to remain in denial. Star Sapphires would kidnap beings who had lost great loves, attempting to reunite them through violet energy constructs that were indistinguishable from the original persons. Their constructs were among the most psychologically sophisticated of any core, capable of mimicking not just the appearance, but the personalities and memories of beings they were designed to represent. A star sapphire could create a violet energy duplicate of a fallen lover that would be virtually identical to the original in every way except for the purple glow that revealed its artificial nature. These constructs served both as weapons and as therapeutic tools, forcing opponents to confront their emotional connections while providing star sapphires with intimate knowledge of their target's psychological vulnerabilities. The emergence of these diverse core transformed the cosmic landscape in ways that no one, not even the Guardians in their ancient wisdom, had anticipated. The universe was no longer divided simply between order and chaos, law and crime, protection and destruction. Instead, it had become an arena where different philosophies of existence competed for dominance, each backed by cosmic power and absolute conviction in their righteousness. The interactions between these emotional armies created complexity that defied simple moral categorization. Red lanterns who fought to punish injustice might find themselves opposed by indigo lanterns seeking to rehabilitate rather than destroy criminals. Blue lanterns attempting to inspire hope could conflict with star sapphires whose version of love required forcing beings into relationships they had not chosen. Green lanterns trying to maintain order might clash with orange lanterns, whose avarice drove them to claim entire solar systems as personal property. Most troubling of all, each core was convinced of its own moral superiority. The red lanterns saw themselves as the universe's immune system, eliminating threats that other organizations were too weak to address. Blue lanterns believed they were cosmic healers, bringing hope to a universe drowning in despair. Star sapphires viewed themselves as matchmakers on a galactic scale, reuniting beings with their true emotional destinies. Even the Indigo tribe, for all their forced compassion, were convinced that their methods represented the highest form of mercy. The stage was set for conflicts that would make the ancient wars between order and chaos seem simple by comparison. The universe now contained 7 different versions of cosmic justice, each backed by limitless power, and each convinced that their emotional approach was the key to universal peace. The emotional spectrum, that had once been a source of power for a single Corps had become the foundation for a cosmic Cold War that threatened to tear reality itself apart along emotional lines. The Green Lantern Corps, despite their recent reconstruction and renewed confidence, found themselves facing a challenge unlike any in their history. They were no longer the sole wielders of cosmic power, no longer the undisputed guardians of universal order. They had become one voice in a choir of emotions, forced to prove that will deserved its place as the central force of cosmic law enforcement. The wars that would follow would test not just the power of different emotions, but their wisdom, whether the universe could survive the collision of 7 absolute truths, each convinced that their path led to salvation and all others led to damnation. The yellow sun that illuminated Qward's antimatter skies cast everything in the sickly hue of fear made manifest, and it was under this corrupted light that the Hal Sinestro forged his masterstroke against the universe he had once sworn to protect. The former Green Lantern had spent years in exile studying the emotional spectrum, analyzing the weaknesses of his former colleagues, and most importantly, building an army that would prove fear was not just another emotion, but the fundamental force that drove all others. The Sinestro Corps that emerged from the antimatter universe was a nightmare made manifest, 7,000 members strong, each one a being who had embraced terror as a tool of control and wielded it with the precision that Sinestro had once brought to his Green Lantern duties. Unlike the chaotic violence of the Red Lanterns or the possessive hunger of Orange Lanterns, the Yellow Lanterns were disciplined soldiers in an army of fear, trained to spread terror systematically and efficiently across the cosmos. Sinestro's recruitment strategy had been as methodical as everything else about his approach to cosmic dominance. He sought out beings who understood that fear was not weakness, but wisdom, the recognition that the universe contained forces capable of destroying everything that organic life held dear. Serial killers who had perfected the art of psychological torture, dictators who had maintained order through carefully calculated brutality, and cosmic entities whose very existence inspired existential dread, all found their way into the ranks of the Sinestro Corps. Each Yellow Lantern was chosen not just for their capacity to feel fear, but for their ability to inspire it in others. Their constructs were designed to exploit primal terrors that existed in every sentient species: the fear of death, of loss, of powerlessness, of being forgotten. A Sinestro Corps member could look at any opponent and instantly know what that being feared most, then create yellow energy manifestations of those specific nightmares, with such detail and psychological accuracy that even the strongest wills could be broken. The philosophy that bound the Sinestro Corps together was elegantly simple and terrifyingly logical. Fear, Sinestro argued, was the only honest emotion. It acknowledged the universe's capacity for destruction and motivated beings to take the precautions necessary for survival. Love could be corrupted into obsession. Hope could become dangerous, delusion. Will could transform into destructive arrogance. But fear never lied about the nature of existence. A universe governed by fear would be a universe where beings made rational decisions based on realistic assessments of danger. More insidiously, Sinestro had recognized that fear could serve as a force for peace more effectively than any other emotion. Beings who were genuinely afraid of the consequences of their actions would be less likely to commit crimes, start wars, or engage in the kind of destructive behavior that required Green Lantern intervention. Terror, properly applied, could create stability that lasted for generations, rather than the temporary peace that resulted from traditional law enforcement. The Corps' organizational structure reflected Sinestro's military background and his understanding of psychological warfare. Unlike the relatively egalitarian Green Lantern Corps, the Sinestro Corps operated on strict, hierarchical principles, where advancement was based on the ability to create and maintain fear in increasingly challenging circumstances. Senior Yellow Lanterns were beings who had literally terrorized entire civilizations into submission, proving their worthiness through the magnitude of the terror they could inspire. At the apex of this hierarchy stood Sinestro himself, no longer the idealistic Green Lantern who had once mentored Hal Jordan, but something far more dangerous, a being who had retained all his tactical brilliance and moral conviction, while discarding the restraints that had once limited his effectiveness. This was not a villain driven by petty motivations, but a cosmic force convinced that the universe required salvation from its own chaotic nature, and that salvation could only be achieved through the systematic application of fear. The war began not with direct assault, but with psychological preparation designed to maximize the terror that would follow. Yellow lanterns appeared at the edges of Green Lantern patrol routes, observing but not engaging, allowing word of their presence to spread throughout sectors that had grown comfortable under Corps protection. The mere knowledge that an organization dedicated to fear was watching created anxiety that fed back into the yellow rings, strengthening the Sinestro Corps even before hostilities officially commenced. When the attacks finally began, they demonstrated tactical sophistication that caught even veteran Green Lanterns unprepared. Rather than engaging in straightforward combat, the Sinestro Corps struck at the psychological foundations of their opponent's confidence. They would appear during routine missions, not to fight, but to reveal intimate knowledge of each Green Lantern's deepest fears and most traumatic memories. Yellow constructs would take the forms of dead loved ones, failed missions, or personal inadequacies made manifest in energy that pulsed with nauseating fear. The most devastating aspect of these early encounters was how they exposed the emotional vulnerabilities that the Green Lantern Corps had never fully acknowledged. Hal Jordan found himself confronted by yellow energy duplicates of the civilians he had failed to save during his time as Parallax, each one accusing him of betraying everything he had once claimed to protect. Guy Gardner faced manifestations of the students he had been unable to help during his teaching career, their voices echoing with disappointment that cut deeper than any physical weapon. John Stewart was forced to watch yellow reconstructions of the planet Xanshi, whose destruction he had inadvertently caused through a moment of overconfidence. These psychological attacks served multiple purposes beyond simple demoralization. They demonstrated to the universe that Green Lanterns were not the invincible protectors they claimed to be, but flawed beings whose power was ultimately limited by their emotional weaknesses. More importantly, they began to create the very fear that strengthened yellow ring constructs, turning the Corps' own emotional responses into weapons that could be used against them. The conflict escalated when Sinestro revealed the true scope of his preparation. Hidden bases throughout the galaxy, each one a fortress of fear that had been years in the construction, suddenly activated simultaneously. These were not mere military installations but psychological warfare centers designed to broadcast terror across entire star systems. Using technology that combined OAN power ring science with Quartian antimatter engineering, these fearcasters could project nightmares directly into the minds of beings light years away. Entire civilizations found themselves paralyzed by sudden, overwhelming terror that seemed to emerge from nowhere. The fear was not random but carefully tailored to exploit the specific psychological vulnerabilities of each species. Humans experienced visions of global extinction and personal powerlessness. Thanagarians were tormented by images of their wings being torn away and their sky-bound civilization crashing to Earth. Ranians faced nightmares of their planet's technology, failing and leaving them defenseless against cosmic forces they could not understand. The Green Lantern Corps' response revealed both their tactical strength and their fundamental philosophical limitations. Individual Green Lanterns could overcome yellow constructs through sufficient will and determination, proving that courage could triumph over fear when properly focused. But they struggled to address the systematic nature of the Sinestro Corps' campaign, finding themselves constantly reacting to crises rather than preventing them. More troubling was the gradual realization that some of the Sinestro Corps' arguments contained uncomfortable truths. In sectors where Yellow Lanterns had established control, crime rates had indeed plummeted to virtually zero. Pirates who had terrorized trade routes for generations had simply disappeared, too terrified to continue their predatory activities. Corrupt governments that had oppressed their populations for centuries suddenly became models of efficient, if authoritarian, administration. The peace that fear created was ugly and psychologically damaging, but it was undeniably effective. The philosophical crisis this created within the Green Lantern Corps was as dangerous as any physical threat they faced. If fear could achieve the order and security that will alone had struggled to maintain, what did that say about their mission? Were they protecting the universe's right to be chaotic and inefficient? Or were they simply too idealistic to implement the harsh solutions that true peace required? The turning point of the war came when Sinestro made his most audacious move, a direct assault on Oa itself, designed not to destroy the Green Lantern Corps, but to expose the hypocrisy at the heart of their organization. Using intelligence gathered during his years as a trusted Corps member, Sinestro led a strike force directly to the rebuilt Central Battery, intending to reveal the dark secrets that the Guardians had hidden even from their own agents. The battle that raged across Oa's perfect geometric landscapes was unlike any conflict in the planet's history. Green and yellow energies clashed in displays of power that could be seen from neighboring star systems, with constructs of such complexity and beauty that they transcended mere warfare to become cosmic art. But the real conflict was philosophical. Sinestro forced the Guardians to confront the contradictions in their approach to cosmic law enforcement, the compromises they had made in the name of order, and the prices others had paid for their vision of universal peace. The revelation that emerged from this confrontation shattered assumptions that had guided the Green Lantern Corps for eons. The Guardians had not merely suppressed their emotions, they had literally imprisoned them in a separate dimension, creating the emotional spectrum entities as byproducts of their psychological amputation. Parallax, Ion, and all the other entities were fragments of Guardian psychology that had been cut away and abandoned, left to find their own purposes in a universe that had never been meant to contain them. This discovery recontextualized everything about the emotional core wars. The various Lantern organizations were not independent developments, but consequences of the Guardians' attempt to eliminate emotion from cosmic law enforcement. Fear, rage, hope, love, compassion, avarice, all of these had been artificially separated from will, creating imbalances that made conflict inevitable rather than coincidental. The immediate tactical consequence was the realization that the Sinestro Corps War could not be won through traditional military means. The Yellow Lanterns were not merely enemies to be defeated, but symptoms of a deeper problem that required fundamental changes to how the universe approached emotional balance. Fear could not be eliminated because it was an essential part of the psychological ecosystem that made courage meaningful. The goal had to be integration rather than domination, harmony rather than victory. The resolution of the war required Green Lanterns to embrace something that the Guardians had spent eons trying to eliminate: emotional complexity. Rather than simply overpowering their Yellow Ring opponents, Corps members began to acknowledge their own fears while refusing to be controlled by them. This psychological integration created a form of willpower that was actually strengthened by emotional authenticity rather than weakened by it. Hal Jordan's final confrontation with Sinestro exemplified this evolution. Instead of denying the fears that his former mentor tried to exploit, Hal acknowledged them while choosing to act heroically despite them. The yellow constructs that had once paralyzed him became sources of motivation, reminders of what he was fighting to prevent, rather than proof of his inadequacy. This transformation allowed him to generate green energy constructs of unprecedented power, not because he had overcome fear, but because he had learned to transform fear into fuel for heroic action. The war's conclusion came not with the destruction of the Sinestro Corps, but with a fundamental redefinition of the relationship between different emotional energies. The universe could not return to the artificial stability of Green Lantern dominance, because that stability had been built on psychological suppression that inevitably created its own opposition. Instead, the various corps would need to find ways to coexist, each serving as a check and balance on the other's potential for excess. Sinestro himself escaped the final battle, but his defeat was philosophical rather than military. His vision of a universe governed by fear had been proven incomplete. Fear without courage was paralysis, just as courage without fear was recklessness. The universe required both emotions working in dynamic tension, each one defining and strengthening the other through their opposition. The Green Lantern Corps that emerged from the Sinestro Corps War was fundamentally different from the organization that had entered it. They had learned to work alongside other emotional energies rather than in opposition to them, recognizing that their role was not to eliminate chaos, but to provide stability within acceptable bounds of cosmic turbulence. The universe had been reminded that peace was not the absence of conflict, but the presence of beings willing to fight for principles worth defending. But even as one cosmic war concluded, the forces unleashed by the emotional awakening continued to stir in the depths of space. Death itself had taken notice of the spectacular conflicts between life-driven emotions, and in the darkness beyond the farthest galaxies, something that was neither alive nor dead began to prepare for its own entry into the cosmic arena. The Sinestro Core War had been merely the opening movement of a symphony of destruction that would culminate in the universe's darkest hour, when death itself would claim the power of a lantern core and seek to extinguish all light forever. In the deepest voids between galaxies, where even starlight feared to venture and the cosmic background radiation whispered of entropy's ultimate victory, something that was neither alive nor dead had been observing the spectacular emotional conflicts that had consumed the universe's attention. Death not as concept or inevitability, but as a conscious force with will and purpose, had watched the rise of the various lantern core with growing interest and mounting hunger. The entity known as Necron had concluded that life's capacity for generating emotional energy made it too dangerous to be allowed to continue indefinitely. The ruler of the land of the unliving had existed since the first organic being drew breath and would persist until the last heartbeat echoed through empty space. Necron was not evil in any sense that mortal minds could comprehend. Evil implied choice, passion, some form of emotional investment in the outcome of events. Death was simply inevitable, as natural and necessary as gravity or entropy. But the emergence of beings who could literally reshape reality through emotional energy had disrupted the cosmic balance that Necron had spent eternity maintaining. From its throne in the realm between life and death, Necron had observed how the emotional spectrum allowed living beings to achieve something that should have been impossible: genuine transcendence of their mortal limitations. Green Lanterns who should have died from fatal injuries continued fighting through sheer will. Blue Lanterns inspired hope that could literally bring the dead back to life. Even the rage of Red Lanterns could sustain beings long past the point where their bodies should have failed. This was more than mere cosmic inconvenience. It was a fundamental challenge to the natural order that death had been appointed to maintain. Life was supposed to be temporary, a brief flicker of organized energy that would inevitably surrender to entropy's embrace. The emotional spectrum had given mortality the tools to resist that inevitability, creating beings who could literally will themselves beyond the reach of death's traditional influence. The solution, as Necron conceived it, was elegantly simple. If life could harness emotion as a source of power, then death could do the same. The universe contained billions of deceased beings whose emotional attachments to the living world remained strong even after their bodies had failed. These connections: love for departed family members, rage at unfinished business, fear of being forgotten, could be weaponized just as effectively as the emotions of the living. The architect of this cosmic necromancy was William Hand, a being whose relationship with death had begun long before he encountered alien technology. As a child on Earth, Hand had been obsessed with mortality in ways that disturbed even his closest family members. He collected dead insects, studied decomposition with scientific fascination, and displayed an intuitive understanding of death's processes that seemed to transcend normal human psychology. When the cosmic entity that would become known as Black Hand encountered William Hand during his adult years, it recognized in him the perfect herald for its master's grand design. Hand's obsession with death was not pathological but prophetic. He had been unconsciously preparing his entire life to serve as the voice of entropy in a universe that had forgotten its proper relationship with mortality. The transformation of William Hand into Black Hand was both physical and metaphysical. His human form became a conduit for energies that existed in the spaces between life and death, allowing him to perceive and manipulate the emotional connections that bound deceased beings to the living world. More importantly, he became capable of generating black energy constructs that could literally drain the life force from living beings while simultaneously animating their corpses as servants of death. The Black Lantern's central battery that emerged from this unholy union was perhaps the most horrifying artifact ever created in the universe's history. Unlike the other emotional batteries that drew power from specific feelings, the Black Battery fed on the absence of emotion, the void left behind when feeling beings died, and their capacity for generating emotional energy was lost forever. This made it exponentially more powerful than any other core's power source, because death was universal, while individual emotions were limited to specific species and psychological types. The recruitment strategy for the Black Lantern Corps differed fundamentally from all other emotional organizations. Rather than seeking living beings who possessed certain psychological characteristics, Black Hand began systematically raising the dead throughout the galaxy, focusing particularly on deceased individuals who had been significant figures in the various Lantern Corps' histories. The psychological impact of facing fallen comrades and loved ones transformed into agents of death proved far more devastating than any purely physical assault. The first wave of Black Lantern resurrections targeted the emotional foundations of each active corps with surgical precision. Abin Sur, the Green Lantern whose death had led to Hal Jordan's recruitment, rose from his grave on Earth with his purple skin, now bearing the sickly luminescence of decay. His constructs, once symbols of order and protection, became instruments designed to exploit Hal's guilt over failing to live up to his predecessor's example. Katma Tui, John Stewart's murdered wife and fellow Green Lantern, returned as a mockery of everything she had represented in life. Where she had once inspired John through her courage and compassion, her Black Lantern form whispered poison about his failures as a husband and protector. The psychological warfare was devastating in its precision. These were not generic enemies to be fought, but beloved figures whose deaths had shaped the living Lantern's understanding of duty and loss. The Red Lantern Corps faced the resurrection of entire civilizations that had been destroyed by the rage that now powered their rings. Worlds that had been reduced to ash by unchecked fury rose again as planets of the dead, their populations transformed into Black Lanterns, who served as constant reminders of rage's capacity for destruction. Atrocitus found himself confronted by the reanimated corpses of his own species, the very beings whose massacre had given birth to his cosmic anger. For the Blue Lantern Corps, the psychological assault was perhaps most cruel of all. Hope, by its very nature, was built on the belief that death was not final, that loss could be overcome, that love transcended mortality. The Black Lanterns perverted this fundamental optimism by demonstrating that death could indeed be overcome, but only in service to entropy rather than life. Saint Walker watched in horror as beings he had inspired to hope were transformed into mockeries of their former selves, their capacity for optimism perverted into weapons against the living. The Star Sapphires faced the resurrection of lost loves whose deaths had originally driven them to join the violet light. The cosmic irony was devastating. These women had become Star Sapphires because their capacity for love had survived the deaths of their beloved partners, and now those same partners returned as Black Lanterns, seeking to extinguish the very love that had sustained them through grief. The Orange Lantern's situation was unique in its horror. Larfleeze discovered that his avarice had literally prevented the natural death processes of the beings he had consumed over millennia. Their life forces, trapped within his ring as constructs, had been denied the release of death while being prevented from truly living. This created a reservoir of spiritual suffering that made them ideal candidates for Black Lantern recruitment. They were beings who were neither alive nor dead, existing in a state of perpetual want that death promised to finally satisfy. As the Black Lantern Corps expanded its influence throughout the galaxy, the living began to understand the true scope of Necron's plan. This was not merely another emotional corps seeking dominance over its rivals, but an existential threat to the concept of life itself. Every being that fell to Black Lantern assault was immediately recruited into their ranks, creating an exponentially expanding army of the dead that grew stronger with each victory. The philosophy underlying the Black Lantern Corps was perhaps the most nihilistic ever conceived. Death, they proclaimed, was not the enemy of life, but its natural conclusion. The various Lantern Corps had upset the cosmic balance by granting living beings the power to transcend their mortality, creating an artificial prolonging of existence that prevented the universe from achieving its natural state of entropy. The Black Lanterns saw themselves not as destroyers but as cosmic janitors, cleaning up the mess that life had made of death's orderly processes. The constructs generated by Black Lantern rings were fundamentally different from those created by other corps. Rather than manifesting the bearer's will or emotion as solid energy, black constructs drew their substance from the void between life and death, creating weapons and tools that existed in a state of perpetual decay. These constructs could not be destroyed through conventional means because they were already dead, and they possessed the unique ability to drain emotional energy from other constructs, weakening opponents while strengthening themselves. Most terrifying of all, Black Lanterns retained the memories and personalities of their living selves, while serving goals that were antithetical to everything they had once believed. A deceased Green Lantern raised as a Black Lantern would remember their oath, their dedication to protecting innocent life, and their love for their fellow Corps members. But they would pursue the extinguishment of all those things with the same determination they had once brought to their protection. The psychological impact on the living was devastating beyond measure. How could someone fight effectively against the reanimated corpse of their spouse, child, or closest friend? How could heroes maintain their determination to protect life when confronted by constant reminders that death claimed everyone eventually? The Black Lantern Corps was not just an army but a philosophical argument made manifest proof that all emotional attachments were ultimately meaningless because death rendered all feelings void. The crisis reached its peak when Nekron himself emerged from the land of the unliving to personally oversee the final phase of his campaign. The Lord of the Dead was a figure of such cosmic horror that merely perceiving him caused psychological trauma in living beings. He was death personified not as the gentle release that ended suffering, but as the hungry void that consumed all meaning, all hope, all possibility of continuation. Nekron's plan for the universe was simple in its totality: the extinguishment of all emotional energy through the systematic elimination of every living being capable of generating feelings. This would not be mere genocide, but cosmic cleansing, returning the universe to the state of perfect entropy that had existed before the first star ignited and disrupted death's peaceful dominion. The entity's power was beyond anything the living Lantern Corps had ever encountered. Where other corps drew their strength from the emotions of their bearers, Nekron could tap directly into the accumulated death energy of every being that had ever lived and died since the universe began. This made him exponentially more powerful than any individual lantern or even entire corps, because death was the one experience that united every form of life regardless of species, psychology, or emotional capacity. The battle lines that formed were not between different emotional philosophies but between existence and void, meaning and emptiness, the spark of consciousness and the dark between the stars. Every living being in the universe, regardless of their previous conflicts or competing ideologies, found themselves united against an enemy that threatened not just their lives, but the very concept of life itself. The war that followed would test whether the universe's capacity for generating emotional energy was stronger than entropy's patient hunger. Whether love, hope, will, fear, rage, compassion, and avarice combined could stand against the ultimate negation of all feeling. In the cosmic darkness that Nekron brought with him, the living would discover whether their emotions were meaningless noise in an indifferent universe or the fundamental forces that gave existence its purpose and beauty. The blackest night had begun, and with it would come the ultimate test of whether life deserved to continue in a universe where death had claimed the power to fight back. The aftermath of the Blackest Night crisis had left scars across the cosmic consciousness that would take eons to heal completely. When the combined might of all 7 Lantern Corps had finally overcome Nekron's assault on existence itself, the victory had come at a price that transformed the fundamental nature of life and death throughout the universe. The white light of creation, the source from which all other emotional energies derived their power, had been awakened and wielded by beings who had never been intended to channel such pure, undiluted force. Hal Jordan, Kyle Rayner, and the other lanterns who had served as temporary conduits for the white light found themselves forever changed by the experience. They had touched the very essence of creation, felt the cosmic force that had sparked the first star and would kindle the last. This exposure had burned away portions of their mortality while leaving them still fundamentally human, creating beings who existed in a liminal space between mortal and eternal, temporal and cosmic. The most immediate consequence of the white light's manifestation was the selective resurrection of beings throughout the galaxy. individuals whose deaths had created significant disruptions in the cosmic balance that the white light sought to restore. These resurrections were not random acts of divine mercy, but calculated adjustments to the universe's emotional equilibrium, bringing back beings whose continued existence was necessary for the stability of the forces they had helped unleash. Aquaman emerged from the ocean depths of Earth, gasping with the shock of renewed life and the weight of memories that included his own death. The former king of Atlantis found himself granted a second chance at existence, but with it came the terrible knowledge of how his death had affected the delicate balance between land and sea that his rule had maintained. His resurrection was not a reward, but a responsibility. The universe required his unique understanding of marine ecosystems and diplomatic experience to address crises that were already building in Earth's depths. The Martian Manhunter's return was perhaps even more complex, as his psychological connection to the concept of community and belonging had been essential to maintaining peace between disparate species across multiple worlds. John Johns awoke to find that his death had created ripple effects throughout the galactic community, as civilizations that had learned to coexist through his mediation had begun reverting to older patterns of suspicion and conflict. His resurrection came with expanded empathic abilities that allowed him to sense emotional imbalances across entire star systems, making him both more powerful and more burdened than he had ever been in life. Boston Brand, the former circus performer who had spent years as the ghostly dead man, found his situation uniquely paradoxical. His resurrection had granted him a physical form for the first time since his murder, but the white light had also enhanced his spiritual abilities beyond their previous limitations. Brand could now interact with both the living and the dead, serving as a bridge between worlds that had become increasingly important as the barriers between life and death continued to blur. The Hawk and Dove avatars, Carter Hall and Dawn Granger, discovered that their resurrections had fundamentally altered their relationship with the cosmic forces of war and peace that they represented. Where they had once embodied opposing principles that created conflict through their interaction, the white light had taught them to synthesize their approaches into something entirely new, a form of cosmic diplomacy that could resolve conflicts through understanding rather than victory. Most significant of all was the resurrection of Maxwell Lord, whose return carried implications that none of the other revivals could match. Lord's death had been a consequence of his mind control abilities being used to manipulate Superman into nearly killing Batman, creating a crisis that had tested the foundations of heroic cooperation throughout Earth's superhuman community. His resurrection suggested that the white light required his particular combination of telepathic power and strategic thinking to address threats that conventional heroism could not handle. But the white light's influence extended far beyond simple resurrection. Throughout the galaxy, beings who had been touched by its power during the final battle against Necron found themselves experiencing enhanced emotional resonance that allowed them to perceive and interact with the emotional spectrum in entirely new ways. Green Lanterns discovered that their constructs could temporarily channel other emotional energies, creating hybrid manifestations that combined will with hope, compassion, or even controlled amounts of fear and rage. This evolution in Lantern abilities created unprecedented opportunities for cooperation between Corps that had previously viewed each other with suspicion or outright hostility. Joint missions became possible where Green Lanterns could work alongside Blue Lanterns to create constructs that were both powerful and inspiring, or coordinate with Red Lanterns to generate controlled fury that could break through obstacles that will alone could not overcome. The philosophical implications were staggering. The artificial separation between different emotions that had defined the Lantern Corps since their creation was revealed to be exactly that, artificial. The emotional spectrum was not meant to be divided into competing factions but experienced as a unified whole, with each emotion serving as a facet of a larger truth about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to cosmic forces. This understanding led to the establishment of what became known as the Emotional Spectrum Council, a governing body that included representatives from all active Lantern Corps working together to maintain cosmic balance rather than pursuing individual agendas. The Council's primary mission was to identify and address situations where emotional imbalances threatened the stability of entire sectors, providing coordinated responses that could draw on the full range of emotional energies as needed. The Green Lantern Corps found their role within this new structure both elevated and complicated. As the largest and most experienced organization, they naturally took a leadership position within the Council, but they also had to abandon their traditional assumption that will was the most important or reliable emotional force. The Guardians of the Universe, those few who had survived the various crises that had claimed most of their number, were forced to confront the limitations of their ancient wisdom and embrace approaches to cosmic law enforcement that incorporated emotional complexity rather than attempting to control it. Hal Jordan's position within this new cosmic order was particularly significant. Having served as the primary conduit for the white light during its manifestation, he retained a unique connection to the source of all emotional energy that made him valuable as both warrior and diplomat. His constructs could temporarily access any point on the emotional spectrum, allowing him to communicate with and understand beings whose psychology was fundamentally different from his own. But this expanded power came with expanded responsibility. Hal found himself serving not just as a Green Lantern, but as a cosmic mediator whose understanding of emotional integration made him essential for resolving conflicts between different corps. His human perspective, once seen as a limitation that required careful management, had become an asset that allowed him to bridge the gap between species whose emotional expressions were radically different. The challenges that emerged during this period of cosmic reorganization were unlike anything the universe had previously experienced. The artificial barriers between different emotional energies had served, despite their limitations, to prevent certain dangerous combinations from occurring. With those barriers weakened, new threats emerged from the intersection of emotions that had never been meant to combine. Love and fear, when merged through inexperienced manipulation of spectrum energies, created obsessions so powerful that they could consume entire star systems as beings became fixated on possessing or protecting objects of their affection. Hope and rage, improperly balanced, generated fanatic movements that sought to create perfect worlds through the elimination of anyone who might disrupt their vision of paradise. Avarice and compassion, when artificially combined, produced beings who sought to help others by forcibly redistributing resources in ways that destroyed the economic systems they were trying to improve. The resolution of these crises required unprecedented cooperation between corps that had never learned to trust each other completely. Red Lanterns had to work alongside Blue Lanterns to calm rage-induced hope without eliminating either emotion entirely. Star Sapphires needed to coordinate with Indigo Lanterns to address love-compassion imbalances while respecting both corps' fundamental approaches to emotional expression. Most challenging of all was the emergence of beings who had been so profoundly affected by the white light that they could no longer be classified as belonging to any single emotional category. These White Lanterns, as they became known, possessed the ability to channel any emotional energy but struggled to maintain stable identities when their psychological foundations could shift between different emotional states without warning. The universe's adjustment to these new realities was neither smooth nor immediate. Civilizations that had developed their cultures around specific emotional expressions found themselves forced to adapt to neighbors whose psychology had been fundamentally altered by exposure to different spectrum energies. Trade agreements, diplomatic protocols, and even basic social interactions had to be renegotiated as beings learned to communicate across emotional differences that had never existed before. Yet for all the challenges and complications, the Brightest Day period represented a unique opportunity for cosmic evolution. The universe was learning to embrace emotional complexity rather than fearing it, developing new forms of cooperation that transcended species barriers and psychological limitations. The Lantern Corps, which had begun as instruments of control and order, were evolving into facilitators of understanding and growth. The Green Lantern Corps that emerged from this transformation retained its commitment to protecting innocent life and maintaining cosmic stability, but its methods had become far more sophisticated and emotionally intelligent. Where the original Corps had imposed order through superior force and determination, the new organization sought to create harmony through understanding and integration of diverse emotional perspectives. The stage was set for new challenges that would test not just the Corps' power, but their wisdom conflicts that would require them to balance competing emotional needs while maintaining the cosmic stability that made growth evolution possible. The universe had learned to embrace the full spectrum of feeling, but it had yet to discover whether that embrace would lead to unprecedented prosperity or to chaos beyond anything that pure logic or simple will could resolve. The brightest day was ending, and with its twilight came the recognition that light and darkness, like all cosmic forces, required each other to create the dynamic tension that made existence meaningful. The revelation that shattered the Green Lantern Corps' understanding of their own history came not through cosmic catastrophe or enemy assault, but through the quiet persistence of scholarly investigation. Hidden within the rebuilt archives of OA, encrypted in databases that had survived the destruction of the Central Battery and the Manhunter massacres, lay evidence of a truth so fundamental and so carefully concealed that even the Guardians themselves had forgotten its implications. The entire foundation of the Green Lantern Corps, their power source, their mission, their very existence had been built upon a lie of such magnitude that its discovery threatened to unravel everything they had accomplished across eons of cosmic service. The being responsible for this revelation was Krona, a name that carried weight and dread among the few Guardians who remembered the early days of their cosmic experiment. Once a Guardian himself, Krona had been exiled from Maltus billions of years earlier for conducting forbidden research into the origin of the universe. His scientific curiosity had led him to construct a machine capable of viewing the moment of creation itself, an act that the other Guardians believed had introduced evil into what had previously been a perfect cosmos. His punishment had been transformation into pure energy and banishment to the antimatter universe, where his consciousness was expected to dissipate harmlessly across eons of isolation. But Krona had not simply faded into cosmic background radiation. His exile had given him perspective that his former colleagues lacked the ability to observe the universe's development from outside the emotional and psychological frameworks that limited Guardian perception. From his vantage point in antimatter space, Krona had witnessed the rise and fall of civilizations, the birth and death of stars, and most importantly, the gradual revelation of how the Guardians' great experiment had systematically corrupted everything it touched. The research that had led to Krona's exile had indeed shown him the moment of universal creation. But what he had seen there challenged every assumption about the nature of existence that his people had developed. The universe had not been born from cosmic accident or divine intervention, but from the collision between positive and antimatter realities, a moment of perfect balance between opposing forces that had created the potential for consciousness, emotion, and the complex interplay between order and chaos that made life possible. The Guardians, in their determination to impose order upon this cosmic chaos, had fundamentally misunderstood their role in universal development. Rather than serving as shepherds guiding natural evolution toward enlightenment, they had become cosmic parasites, drawing power from the very forces they sought to control and gradually draining the universe of the emotional diversity that made growth and change possible. The Green Lantern Corps was not a force for protection, but an instrument of stagnation, preventing the cosmos from achieving the dynamic balance that its creation had been intended to establish. This revelation had implications that extended far beyond philosophical disagreement. Krona's research had revealed that the central power battery on OA was not simply a focus for willpower energy, but a cosmic drain that gradually absorbed and neutralized the other emotional energies of the spectrum. The yellow impurity that had supposedly been created by Parallax's imprisonment was actually a natural safety mechanism, the universe's attempt to prevent the green light from achieving complete dominance over all other emotions. The various crises that had plagued the Corps throughout its history, the Manhunter massacres, Parallax's corruption of Hal Jordan, the emergence of the other emotional core, were not random events, but inevitable consequences of the imbalance the Guardians had created. Each crisis had been the universe's attempt to restore equilibrium by generating opposition to Green Lantern hegemony, creating checks and balances that the Guardians had interpreted as threats to cosmic order. Krona's return to normal space was carefully orchestrated to maximize both his tactical advantage and the psychological impact of his revelations. Rather than announcing his presence through direct assault, he began systematically infiltrating the Guardian hierarchy, using his intimate knowledge of their psychology and history to manipulate their decision-making processes. the Guardians found themselves making choices that seemed logical and necessary, but gradually isolated them from the Green Lantern Corps they had created. The first sign of corruption was the Guardians' announcement of new protocols designed to increase Corps efficiency and reduce the influence of emotional variables in cosmic law enforcement. These changes seemed reasonable on the surface: standardized responses to common threats, reduced autonomy for individual lanterns, more direct Guardian oversight of sector assignments. But their cumulative effect was to transform the Corps from an organization of independent heroes into a military force whose primary loyalty was to institutional authority rather than moral principle. Hal Jordan was among the first to recognize that something fundamental had changed in the Guardians' approach to Corps management. His experience as Parallax had given him sensitivity to subtle forms of corruption that might escape other Lanterns' notice, and the new protocols triggered psychological alarms that he could not ignore. The Guardians' explanations for their policy changes were logical and well-reasoned, but they reflected a coldness and rigidity that reminded Hal uncomfortably of his own descent into cosmic tyranny. Guy Gardner's reaction was more direct and considerably more confrontational. The former special education teacher had never been comfortable with authority figures who prioritized institutional needs over individual welfare, and the Guardians' new approach violated every principle that had motivated his decision to become a Green Lantern. His challenges to Guardian authority were dismissed as emotional excess and insubordination, but they served to crystallize growing unrest among Corps members who shared his concerns. John Stewart approached the problem with characteristic methodical analysis, documenting patterns in Guardian behavior that suggested external influence or psychological compromise. His architectural training had taught him to recognize when structural modifications served purposes other than their stated goals, and the changes in Corps protocol displayed exactly that kind of hidden agenda. His reports to fellow Lanterns provided concrete evidence that something was systematically undermining the organization's founding principles. Kyle Rayner's artistic sensibilities detected the corruption in ways that pure logic could not quantify. The aesthetic harmony that had once characterized Guardian decision-making had been replaced by rigid formalism that felt artificial and imposed. His constructs, which normally flowed naturally from his imagination, began requiring conscious effort to maintain when created in the presence of Guardians, as if some force was interfering with the creative process that powered his ring. The crisis reached its breaking point when Krona revealed himself and his agenda to both the Guardians and the Corps simultaneously. Broadcasting on all Green Lantern communication frequencies, the ancient exile delivered a presentation that combined irrefutable scientific evidence with philosophical arguments that challenged the very foundation of everything the Corps believed about their mission and purpose. The revelation that the Guardians had been corrupted by their former colleague was devastating enough, but Krona's broader claims about the nature of cosmic balance created schisms within the Corps that threatened to tear the organization apart permanently. Some Lanterns, particularly those from species that had always been uncomfortable with the Guardians' authoritarian approach, immediately accepted Krona's arguments and began questioning whether their service to the Corps had actually been harmful to universal development. Others, especially veterans who had built their identities around Corps service and Guardian wisdom, rejected Krona's claims as the manipulations of a bitter exile seeking revenge against those who had rightfully punished his dangerous research. These Lanterns viewed any challenge to Guardian authority as betrayal of the oaths they had sworn and the sacrifices they had made in service to cosmic order. The conflict that erupted was unlike any in Corps history, because it was fundamentally a civil war between different visions of what the Green Lantern organization should represent. Traditional loyalists fought to preserve the institutional structure that had given meaning to their service, while reformers sought to transform the Corps into something that could serve cosmic balance rather than Guardian ideology. The battle lines were complicated by the fact that individual Lanterns found themselves torn between competing loyalties and contradictory evidence. Hal Jordan's respect for Guardian wisdom conflicted with his personal experience of how institutional authority could become corrupted. Guy Gardner's instinctive distrust of established power structures was balanced by his genuine affection for fellow Corps members who believed they were fighting for justice. John Stewart's analytical nature was challenged by data that supported multiple interpretations, none of which were entirely satisfactory. The physical conflicts that erupted across the galaxy were heartbreaking in their intensity and personal nature. Green Lanterns, who had served together for decades, found themselves creating constructs designed to capture or incapacitate colleagues whose judgment they had once trusted completely. Ring-bearers, who had saved each other's lives in countless battles, were forced to fight each other over philosophical differences that neither side could fully articulate or resolve. Krona's manipulation of these conflicts was subtle and devastating. Rather than directly controlling either faction, he provided just enough evidence and logical argument to each side to ensure that both believed they were fighting for the salvation of everything they held dear. Loyalists received information suggesting that the reformers had been corrupted by antimatter influence and posed an existential threat to cosmic stability. Reformers were given data indicating that continued Guardian rule would inevitably lead to universal stagnation and emotional death. The resolution of the crisis required something that none of the combatants had anticipated: the intervention of the emotional spectrum entities themselves. Ion, Parallax, Adara, Proselyte, Predator, Ophidian, and the other living embodiments of pure emotion had been observing the conflict with growing concern, recognizing that the destruction of the Green Lantern core would destabilize the cosmic balance that all emotional energies required for their continued existence. The entity's intervention took the form of direct communication with key figures from both sides of the conflict, providing perspectives that transcended the limited viewpoints of individual core members or even Guardians. Ion spoke to Hal Jordan about the true nature of willpower as a force that enabled rather than controlled other emotions. Parallax, no longer the corrupting influence it had once been, explained to Guy Gardner how fear could serve courage rather than opposing it when properly understood and channeled. These revelations led to a fundamental restructuring of the relationship between the Guardians and the core they had created. Rather than serving as absolute authorities whose wisdom was beyond question, the Guardians would become advisors and coordinators whose role was to facilitate rather than control Green Lantern activities. Individual Lanterns would be granted greater autonomy in determining how best to serve their sector's needs, while also accepting greater responsibility for the consequences of their decisions. Krona's defeat came not through superior force, but through the restoration of the cosmic balance he had sought to destroy. When the Green Lantern Corps learned to work in harmony with other emotional energies rather than attempting to dominate them, Krona's manipulations lost their power to create lasting division. The universe had evolved beyond the rigid structures that had made his revenge possible, developing new forms of organization that could adapt and grow rather than simply maintaining static order. The Green Lantern Corps that emerged from the War of the Green Lanterns was fundamentally different from the organization that had entered it. They had learned that blind loyalty to institutional authority was a form of moral cowardice, that true service required the courage to question and improve the systems they served. They had discovered that their strength came not from unity of thought, but from diversity of perspective, not from emotional suppression, but from emotional integration. Most importantly, they had proven that even the most fundamental assumptions about their mission and purpose could be challenged and reformed without destroying the essential values that made their service worthwhile. The Corps had faced the possibility of its own dissolution and emerged stronger, wiser, and more committed than ever to protecting the universe's capacity for growth, change, and emotional development. The war was over, but the work of rebuilding trust and redefining purpose had only just begun.